Before we drift into the quiet hum of medieval tedium, consider subscribing to At Hollow Midnight for more tales designed to gently nudge your thoughts away from the day's clamor. Chapter 1. The monastic snooze, the chill of the pre-dawn air, thick with the scent of damp stone and stale incense, crept under the rough wool of Brother Eadwig's habit, settling deep into his bones. It was the hour of vigils, that ungodly, or perhaps supremely godly, time when the world outside the abbey walls was still shrouded in the deepest, most impenetrable sleep, while within, the monks were roused from their own meager slumber. The great bell of the Abbey of St. Alcuin, a sonorous beast of bronze, had long since ceased its booming pronouncements, leaving behind only the echoing silence that always followed such grand disturbances. Edwig, not quite 25 years of age, but already bearing the slightly stooped posture of a man who spent too much time hunched over illuminated manuscripts, shuffled along the cold flagstones of the cloister walk, his breath pluming faintly in the gloom. His fellow brethren, a procession of shadowy figures, moved with the quiet solemnity of ghosts, each a vessel of weary piety. The chapel, when they finally reached its cavernous embrace, offered little respite from the cold, but at least the flickering oil lamps cast pools of weak, dancing light upon the ancient, time-worn pews. The air was heavy, as always, with the scent of beeswax and the faint, almost imperceptible mustiness of countless hours of prayer. Edwig found his usual spot, a particular niche near a draughty window that ironically offered a sliver of natural light once the sun grudgingly decided to make its appearance hours later. He settled onto the hard wooden bench, his knees protesting mildly as he knelt and waited. The waiting was an integral part of monastic life, an endless series of pauses, of quiet anticipations before the next round of chanting, the next laborious transcription, the next meager meal of boiled greens and hard bread. Monastic existence, Eadwig had often reflected in the dark corners of his mind, was less a journey of spiritual elevation and more a marathon of enduring quiet. The chanting began, a low, guttural murmur that slowly swelled into a monotonous drone, rising and falling like the tide in a particularly uninteresting sea. Psalms ancient and revered tumbled from the lips of the brethren, their voices a collective hum that seemed to vibrate through the very stone of the chapel. Dominus illuminatio mea, et salus mea. The words blurred into an indistinguishable stream, a soothing, hypnotic lullaby that was, to Eadwig's weary mind, the greatest enemy of all. Sleep, Granada. It hovered at the edges of his consciousness, a dark velvet cloak threatening to envelop him, to pull him down into its dreamless depths. He pinched the bridge of his nose, shook his head subtly, anything to keep the heavy eyelids from succumbing. He had tried every trick in the book of monastic survival, digging his nails into his palms, mentally reciting the multiplication tables, even attempting to conjure an entire banquet of roasted meats and sweet pastries in his mind. But still, the encroaching darkness of sleep persisted. His gaze drifted from the worn prayer book in his hands to the large, beautifully illuminated manuscript resting on the lectern before him. It was a commentary on the book of Job, painstakingly copied and embellished by generations of monks, its margins adorned with intricate vine patterns, tiny birds, and occasional, almost imperceptible grotesque figures peeking from behind swirling leaves. These marginalia, often humorous or even irreverent, were the small secret rebellions of past scribes against the unyielding solemnity of their work. A tiny, almost invisible snail crawling along a gilded initial caught his eye, a meticulous detail that spoke of a monk who perhaps shared Eadwig's struggle against the profound, soul-sapping tedium. It was a thought that blossomed into an idea, a tiny spark in the vast gray landscape of his boredom. He glanced around discreetly, as he often did. Most of the brothers were either deep in their own reveries, eyes closed in what could be prayer or incipient slumber, or staring blankly ahead, their faces masks of pious endurance. Abbot Thomas, a man whose piety was as thick and unyielding as the stone walls themselves, sat at the head of the chapel, his back ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on some distant celestial point. He was oblivious, as always, to the minor insurrections of the human spirit. Edwig's fingers, almost on their own accord, strayed to the small pouch tucked into the folds of his habit. Within it lay a sliver of lead stylus and a folded piece of discarded parchment, salvaged from the waste bin in the scriptorium. He had kept it, a small act of defiance against the abbey's strictures on frugality, telling himself it was for jotting down important scriptural notes that might occur to him during prayer, though such epiphanies were exceedingly rare. Carefully, ever so carefully, he unfolded the parchment, positioning it flat against the inside cover of his personal prayer book, which lay open before him. The vellum of the book would conceal his illicit activity from a casual glance. His movements were slow, deliberate, each rustle of the parchment muted by the droning chants. He dipped the lead stylus, not into ink, for that would leave too permanent a mark and the smell would be a betrayal, but simply allowed its blunt gray tip to glide across the smooth, slightly textured surface of the parchment. The sound was a barely audible scratch, swallowed by the cavernous chapel and the communal chanting. What to draw? His mind, suddenly liberated from the suffocating grip of boredom, flitted from one absurd image to another. A pig in a monk's habit? Too scandalous. A caricature of Brother Gregory, whose snores often punctuated the night office like distant thunder. Perhaps too personal. He started with a simple geometric shape. A triangle, then a circle, then connected them into an abstract pattern, a meaningless doodle that was, nevertheless, an act of creation, a tiny rebellion against the enforced stillness of his mind. He then sketched a small, rather lopsided bird, its wings outstretched, as if attempting to escape the confines of the parchment. A fleeting image of freedom, perhaps, or simply a subconscious expression of his own yearning for anything beyond the confines of the abbey. The act of pressing the stylus to the parchment, of guiding it in even the most insignificant lines, was a balm to his restless spirit. It was an engagement, a small, secret focus that kept the tendrils of sleep at bay far more effectively than any mental arithmetic. The mere physical act, the slight tension in his fingers, the quiet concentration required to make the lines straight, grounded him. He added a small whimsical flower, then a tiny, almost invisible mouse peeking from behind the flower. These were not works of art, nor were they particularly profound, but they were They were the product of his own wandering mind, a small assertion of his individuality in a life designed to erase it. The chanting continued, wave after wave of Latin verses, each indistinguishable from the last. Edwig, however, was no longer merely enduring. He was occupied discreetly, subtly. The fear of being caught, a tiny prickle at the back of his neck, was outweighed by the sheer relief of having something, anything, to distract him from the crushing weight of the passing hours. The prayers stretched on, through vigils and lauds, then prime, each a fresh assault on his dwindling patience. But with his secret project nestled within his prayer book, Edwig found himself almost content. He was awake, yes, but more importantly, he was mentally active. He was thinking, creating, however modestly. He began to imagine a story for the bird he had drawn, a tale of its escape from a gilded cage, of its journey across vast lands, of its encounters with strange creatures and even stranger humans. It was a nascent flicker of narrative, a tiny seed planted in the fertile ground of profound monastic boredom. The sun, a pale, anemic disk, finally began to peek over the eastern horizon, casting long, thin shadows through the chapel windows. But Edwig barely noticed. His world, for now, had shrunk to the parchment in his hands, and the quiet hum of his own imagination. Chapter 2. A saintly obsession. The days within the Abbey of St. Alcuin folded into one another with the methodical, unyielding rhythm of the monastic clock. Each hour was accounted for, each activity prescribed. From the pre-dawn frigidity of vigils to the final, murmured prayers of Compline. For Brother Edwig, the endless cycle was less a spiritual journey and more a test of sheer, unadulterated endurance against the relentless tide of boredom. The small, ill-lit sketches he had begun to scrawl in the margins of his personal prayer book had offered a fleeting, almost sinful reprieve. A tiny window into a mind that stubbornly refused to be wholly subdued by liturgical repetition. Yet, even these small acts of artistic rebellion eventually began to feel repetitive, like drawing the same lopsided bird or whimsical flower over and over, until their charm, however slight, evaporated into the same gray monotony they were meant to combat. His spirit yearned for something more, a deeper engagement, a narrative thread to follow, even if only within the confines of his own head. It was during his allotted hours in the scriptorium, a place usually filled with the whisper of turning pages and the scratching of quills, that Edwig's restless mind found a new, unexpected anchor. The scriptorium itself was a vast, echoing chamber, perpetually cool and dimly lit, its high arched windows admitting only grudging shafts of light that seemed to merely emphasize the pervasive gloom. Dust motes danced in these slender beams, like tiny, lost souls caught in the perpetual motion of time. The air here was thick with the scent of old parchment, of lamp oil, and the faint coppery tang of iron gall ink, a perfume of scholarship and slow, deliberate labor. Edwig was usually tasked with the tedious work of copying sermons, or transcribing mundane abbey records, work that required meticulous attention to detail, but offered absolutely no intellectual stimulation. His hand would cramp, his eyes would ache, and his mind would drift, a free-ranging spirit longing for anything but the next Latin adverb. One particularly drab afternoon, as the rain drummed a dreary rhythm on the slate roof, Father Anselm, the venerable Custos Librorum, or keeper of books, had instructed Edwig to rearrange a section of the Abbey's small, yet surprisingly comprehensive, library. This was a task Edwig secretly relished, not for the organizational challenge, but for the rare opportunity it afforded to browse, to touch books that were usually locked away, their contents shielded from inquisitive hands. Most of the volumes were theological treatises, dry commentaries, or liturgical texts, but interspersed among them were the occasional historical chronicles, herbal remedies, and, most captivatingly to Edwig's imagination, the lives of the saints. He had always found these hagiographies, these accounts of martyrs and holy men and women, to be a peculiar blend of the inspiring and the utterly baffling. They were often dramatic, recounting tales of miraculous endurance, divine intervention, and gruesome suffering. Yet many were also strangely devoid of character or personal detail, presenting saints as two-dimensional paragons of virtue rather than flesh and blood individuals. Their lives were often presented as a series of improbable events culminating in a spectacular, usually bloody demise. It was as if the human element had been painstakingly sanded away, leaving behind only the stark, unblemished marble of sainthood. As he carefully lifted a heavy, leather-bound volume titled Passionis Sanctorum from a high shelf, a thin, unbound sheaf of vellum slips tumbled from between its pages. They were old, yellowed, and barely legible, written in a hand that was distinctly older and less refined than the abbé's usual script. Curiosity, a rare and welcome sensation, pricked at Edwig. He carefully gathered the slips and, finding a quiet corner, illuminated by a weak lamp, began to decipher the faded script. What he found was a fragment, a woefully incomplete account of a certain Saint Aldhelm. The name itself was unremarkable, swallowed by the countless other names in the grand tapestry of martyrology. But the story, or what little of it there was, immediately captured Eadwig's attention. It spoke of Aldhelm, a humble shepherd boy living in a remote, forgotten corner of Britannia, long before the Saxons had arrived in full force. He was described as possessing an unusual, almost preternatural ability to soothe wild animals, a detail that resonated with Eadwig's own quiet fondness for the abbey cat. The text went on to describe a brief encounter with a small band of Roman soldiers, not the usual brutish persecutors of saints, but merely a scouting party, lost and seeking direction. Aldhelm, in his innocence and piety, had offered them hospitality, sharing his meager bread and water, and even tending to their injured horse. And then the fragment abruptly ended. There was no mention of his conversion, no grand acts of faith, no dramatic confrontation, and most importantly, no martyrdom. The last sentence simply stated, "And the centurion, whose name was Marcus, marveled at the boy's simple goodness, and departed with his men into the darkening woods, leaving Aldhelm by his flock." That was it. No beheading, no burning, no arrows, no wild beasts in the arena. Just a simple, almost pastoral scene, followed by utter silence. It was as if the author had simply dropped his quill mid-sentence and walked away, leaving Aldhelm's fate suspended in the air like an unanswered prayer. Eadwig reread the fragment several times, his brow furrowed in a mixture of fascination and frustration. It was so unlike the other lives of the saints, which typically detailed the entire trajectory from piety to peril to glorious death. This Saint Aldhelm, if he was indeed a saint, seemed to have been canonized for a pleasant afternoon encounter, and then nothing. His heart thumped with an unfamiliar excitement. This wasn't merely incomplete, it was begging for completion. The vast gaping void in Aldhelm's story was like an empty parchment, inviting lines to be drawn, words to be written. Over the next few days, Eadwig found himself drawn to the Lives of the Saints section of the library with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He searched for other mentions of Aldhelm, poring over ancient indexes, consulting dusty calendars of saints, and even discreetly inquiring with Father Anselm, who, after a moment of thoughtful silence, merely shrugged and declared Aldhelm to be a very minor and largely unrecorded martyr. Perhaps a local veneration whose cult did not spread. This only deepened Eadwig's fascination. A forgotten saint, a story half told. It was a blank canvas, perfectly suited for a mind yearning to escape the confines of monastic reality. During the prescribed hours of meditation, when his brethren sat in stoic silence, or during the long repetitive chants of the divine office, Eadwig's thoughts were no longer about preventing sleep. Instead, they were consumed by Aldhelm. What happened after the Romans left? Did they return? Did Aldhelm become a hermit? Did he perform miracles for his sheep? Did he, by some strange turn of fate, end up as a minor official in a Roman outpost, converting his colleagues through sheer, quiet piety before an accidental, unmartyr-like death involving a runaway chariot and a particularly stubborn mule? The possibilities, however absurd, were endless. He began to view the blank margins of his prayer book, and the scraps of parchment he still kept hidden, not as a space for mere doodles, but as a fertile ground for narrative. The bird he had drawn previously, the one seemingly trying to escape, suddenly seemed like a symbol for Aldhelm, a soul yearning to break free from the confines of an unfinished story. He found himself mentally constructing scenarios, imagining dialogues, even envisioning the landscapes of ancient Britannia as Aldhelm might have seen them. His mind, once a barren field, was now teeming with hypothetical sheep, Roman centurions, and the distant bleating of possibility. The weight of the monastic routine, which had felt so suffocating, now served as an unexpected crucible for his burgeoning imagination. The enforced silence, the lack of external stimulation, the sheer crushing tedium, all these things inadvertently pushed Eadwig deeper into the inner landscape of his mind. The monastery, designed to strip away worldly distractions, had instead created a vacuum that his mind, almost instinctively, began to fill with the adventures of a forgotten shepherd boy. He found himself anticipating the quiet hours, not for rest, but for the uninterrupted space they offered to weave new threads into Aldhelm's woefully incomplete tapestry. The boredom was no longer an enemy. It was a catalyst. The obscure saint, Aldhelm, had become Eadwig's unlikely obsession, a puzzle demanding to be solved, a story begging to be told, and Eadwig the bored monk was perhaps the only one in the whole of Christendom willing, or perhaps bored enough, to tell it. The quiet rustle of parchment, the faint, almost imperceptible scratch of laid stylus against vellum, would soon become the sounds of a very quiet revolution, beginning, as so many strange things do, with a saint nobody remembered, and a monk who had far too much time to think. Chapter 3. Margins become canvases. The Abbey of St. Alcuin continued its stately, unhurried march through the seasons, each day a near-perfect replica of the one before it. The chants rose and fell, the bells tolled. The meals of thin gruel and stale bread were consumed with quiet solemnity. For most of the brethren, this was the natural order, a path to spiritual enlightenment through rigorous discipline and the suppression of worldly desire. For Brother Eadwig, however, this unwavering routine had ceased to be a path, and had instead become a vast, featureless plain of profound, soul-numbing tedium. Yet, within this landscape of enforced quietude, the seed of his obsession with St. Aldhelm had taken root, and with each passing hour, it began to send out vigorous, fantastical shoots. The incomplete fragment of Aldhelm's life, a mere whisper of a beginning, had become a canvas, not just for Eadwig's idle thoughts, but for the full, unrestrained flourish of his imagination. The narrow margins of his prayer book, once suitable for a lopsided bird or a whimsical flower, now felt utterly inadequate. His clandestine artistic endeavors had evolved. The lead stylus, his silent accomplice, now traced not aimless doodles, but elaborate scenes, tiny, detailed vignettes that unfolded the ever-expanding narrative of Aldhelm's life. He began by attempting to logically, or at least semi-plausibly, fill in the blanks. What Eadwig, a humble shepherd boy, do after Roman soldiers departed? He would likely continue to shepherd, of course. But what if those soldiers had left something behind? A discarded Roman helmet, perhaps, which Aldhelm, in his innocence, used as a feeding trough for a particularly sickly lamb. This small, mundane detail became the genesis of a grander idea. What if the lamb, miraculously cured, was not just a lamb, but a descendant of a magical, ancient lineage of ovine wisdom? And what if, one moonlit night, this lamb, whose name Eadwig decided was Fluffybot, in a moment of pure, unadulterated whimsy, he later judiciously changed it to Agnes, thinking it sounded more saintly, though Fluffybot remained a cherished secret in his heart, spoke to Aldhelm. The first conversation was hesitant, a mere bay that in Aldhelm's pure heart translated into a profound revelation about the healing properties of certain riverside herbs. But soon Agnes, the magically inclined sheep, was dispensing advice on everything from pasture management to the deeper philosophical implications of shearing. Eadwig chuckled to himself as he carefully drew Agnes, complete with tiny spectacles perched precariously on its snout, offering a scroll of wisdom to a wide-eyed Aldhelm. The absurdity delighted him. It was a delightful subversion of the standard hagiography, where wisdom usually descended from heaven, not from a talking sheep. But conversations with sheep, however profound, were not enough to sustain a saint's narrative for long. Eadwig, recalling the oft-repeated tales of Roman persecution from other martyrologies, decided Aldhelm's peaceful encounter with Marcus and his men was simply a prelude. The Romans, he reasoned, must return, but not as benevolent, lost souls. They would return as oppressors, seeking to enforce the emperor's will and demand sacrifices to pagan gods. This was where the dramatic battles came in. Hedwig had only a vague understanding of Roman military tactics, gleaned from a few faded illustrations in the abbey's ancient histories. A phalanx here, a legionnaire there. His battles were less strategic maneuvers and more glorious, chaotic melees. Aldhelm, armed with nothing but his shepherd's crook and guided by the sagacious Agnes, would rally his flock, not just the sheep, but also a particularly surly badger named Bertram and a stoic old owl called Professor Hoot, to defend his sacred lands. These battles, as envisioned by Hedwig and painstakingly scratched onto his precious parchment scraps, were magnificent in their illogic. Roman legionnaires, confused by a synchronized stampede of angry sheep, would trip over their own sandals. Bertram the badger, with surprising agility, would gnaw through leather graves, while Professor Hoot, with a piercing cry, would dive-bomb centurions, disorienting them with his wisdom. Aldhelm, meanwhile, would stand firm, protected by a divine aura that reflected arrows back at their bewildered archers. Hedwig spent hours during the office, fingers cramped, sketching small triumphant Aldhelms fending off miniature disgruntled Romans. The visual humor, though only visible to his own eyes, was a private joy that kept him remarkably awake through the longest liturgical hours. He justified these increasingly outlandish elements by telling himself that saints' lives were, after all, full of miracles, and what was a talking sheep if not a small woolly miracle? Then came the secret romance. This was a delicate matter for a saint, but Hedwig found a way. After one particularly ferocious yet comically inept Roman assault on Aldhelm's pastures, a young Roman noblewoman, Lady Aurelia, was left behind, wounded and disoriented. She was not a warrior, but merely an unfortunate traveler caught in the skirmish. Aldhelm, in his boundless compassion, tended to her wounds. Aurelia, initially haughty and disdainful of the humble shepherd, slowly began to see the true goodness within him. Hedwig sketched her with flowing robes and a delicate aristocratic nose, initially scowling, then softening. Their romance was, by necessity, a chaste one, a love of the spirit rather than the flesh, but no less passionate for it. It was a love complicated by their differing faiths and social standings, a love expressed through shared gazes across moonlit fields, through the quiet exchange of wildflowers, and through Aurelia's growing fascination with Aldhelm's ability to converse with animals. Agnus, the wise sheep, sometimes offered Aurelia cryptic advice, much to her bewilderment, while Bertram the badger maintained a suspicious, grumpy silence towards her, only occasionally grunting approval when she fetched him a particularly plump beetle. This romance was the most daring of Hedwig's editions. He knew it pushed the boundaries of hagiographical convention, perhaps even strayed into dangerous territory for a monk in his position. But the story needed a human heart, a touch of earthly yearning amidst the divine interventions and talking beasts. Aurelia eventually became Aldhelm's devout, if secretly enamored, convert, aiding him in his quiet resistance against the pagan Romans. Their bond was a silent testament to love transcending societal strictures, a truly secret romance that blossomed under the watchful eyes of the sheep and the grumpy supervision of the badger. The project grew, os. The margins of Hedwig's prayer book, initially a private canvas, soon proved too restrictive. He began to squirrel away larger pieces of discarded vellum from the scriptorium, scraps deemed too small or imperfect for official use. He'd smooth them out, sometimes pressing them under his straw mattress at night to flatten them, and then, under the cloak of darkness or during the extended mind-numbing afternoon reading sessions, he would pull out his lead stylus and continue his grand narrative. The scratch of lead on vellum became the quiet soundtrack to his secret life, a sound only he could hear amidst the drone of communal prayers or the rhythmic scraping of other monks' quills. His days became segmented, not by the monastic clock, but by the opportunities to add to Aldhelm's tale. The morning office was for plotting battle scenes. The midday reading was for developing the nuanced glances between Aldhelm and Aurelia. The evening compline, with its dim light, was for sketching the expressive faces of Bertram, the Badger, or Professor Hoot. He lived two lives, the visible one of Brother Eadwig, pious, diligent, at least outwardly so, enduring the endless boredom, and the hidden one of the chronicler of St. Aldhelm, a world of improbable adventures, speaking animals, and a love story that was, in its own way, as miraculous as any divine intervention. The boredom had not only sparked his imagination, it had cultivated it, nurtured it, and allowed it to bloom into something vibrant and utterly delightfully heretical. He was creating a new saint, not one carved from the traditional marble of suffering, but one woven from the threads of whimsy, daring, and the desperate need for a bored monk to simply tell a better story. The risk of discovery, a gnawing unease that sometimes pricked at him, was a small price to pay for the escape and exhilaration that this secret world provided. He had, quite inadvertently, become the first known fanfiction author, and his current work in progress was reaching epic proportions, all within the silent, solemn voice of Saint Alcuin. Chapter 4. The first fanfiction line, the perpetual twilight of the scriptorium, pierced only by grudging shafts of anemic daylight or the wavering glow of tallow candles, had become Brother Eadwig's most treasured sanctuary, not for the holy texts it housed, nor for the solemn labor it demanded, but for the quiet, uninterrupted space it afforded for the clandestine weaving of his personal saga. The Abbey of St. Alcuin continued its relentless, monotonous grind. The unending chants, the communal silence that felt less like peace and more like a heavy shroud, the sparse meals that satisfied neither body nor soul. Yet, for Eadwig, the physical confines and intellectual barrenness of his existence had inadvertently created a fertile ground for an entirely different world to bloom within his mind. The drawings, the whimsical additions to the margins, had long ceased to be mere doodles. They were now storyboards, silent frames from a grand epic playing out behind his solemn monastic facade. Magnus, the spectacles-wearing, philosophizing sheep, Bertram, the gruff but loyal badger, Professor Hoot, the sage owl, and the tragic chaste romance between St. Aldhelm and the Roman noblewoman, Lady Aurelia, had become more real, more vibrant than the hushed whispers of his brethren, or the echoing Latin of the Psalms. The problem, as Eadwig had come to realize with a quiet sigh of frustration, was that pictures alone, however detailed or humorously rendered, could not fully capture the nuanced wit of Agnes, nor the profound moral dilemmas faced by Aldhelm, nor the unspoken yearning in Aurelia's eyes. The battles he depicted, with Roman legionnaires being confounded by a stampede of enraged sheep, lacked the crackle of dialogue, the triumphant roar of Aldhelm, or the bewildered cries of the defeated. He needed words. He yearned for words, not the hallowed ancient words of Scripture that rolled off his tongue without touching his soul, but new words, words that would breathe full, vibrant life into his fantastical creation. This desire, however, brought with it a disquieting weight, a subtle but insistent throb of unease at the back of his mind. To draw was one thing, a minor transgression, a permissible indulgence in an otherwise austere existence. Even the most zealous of abbots might overlook a small, innocuous snail in the margin, attributing it to a momentary lapse of concentration, or perhaps even a subtle allegorical meaning. But to be rewriting, to put quill to parchment, and commit words his own unauthorized, imaginative words to the sacred realm of text, especially in connection to a saint, however obscure, was an entirely different matter. It felt less like a marginalia and more like a full-blown heresy. The abbey had its rules, strictures carved not just into stone, but into the very fabric of monastic life. There were rules for silence, rules for prayer, rules for eating, rules for sleeping, and most emphatically, rules for the sacred act of transcription. To copy was to preserve, to illuminate was to enhance the divine word, but never ever was one to invent, to embellish, to alter the lives of saints. However sparse, were sacrosanct records of God's grace, not malleable clay for a bored monk's amusement. Edwig knew this deep in his bones, a knowledge ingrained since his novitiate. The thought of writing his own editions felt like stepping onto hallowed ground with muddy boots, like whispering a joke in the solemn silence of a cathedral. It was a profound act of disrespect, a spiritual defiance. Yet the urge persisted, a quiet but relentless drumbeat against the walls of his self-imposed restraint. The story of Old Helm, as it existed in the Abbey's fragmentary record, was a mere skeleton, a whisper of a possibility. Edwig's Oldhelm, however, was a living, breathing entity full of quirks and courage, surrounded by a menagerie of philosophical animals, and a love interest more compelling than any saintly celibate he had ever encountered in the formal texts. To leave these characters trapped within the silent confines of his drawings felt like a betrayal, a failure of his burgeoning, if peculiar, artistic duty. The decision coalesced during the morning office, a particularly dreary session dedicated to a lengthy and uninspired commentary on the Minor Prophets. The words washed over Edwig like lukewarm bathwater, utterly failing to engage his mind. His gaze drifted, as it often did, to the small, carefully folded scraps of vellum hidden in the inner pocket of his habit, the very scraps on which he sketched Oldhelm's latest adventures. He saw in his mind's eye a particularly vivid scene. Oldhelm, standing defiant before a small detachment of Roman soldiers, his crook raised, while Agnes the sheep stood beside him, poised to deliver a scathing, witty retort to the centurion's arrogance. The image was so clear, the dialogue so distinct in his head, that merely drawing it felt insufficient. He needed to writing what Agnes said. A tremor, half fear, half exhilaration, coursed through him. This was the line. This was the precise, invisible boundary he was about to cross. The act would be an admission, not just to himself, but to the very parchment he was defiling, that he was no longer merely meditating on a saint's life. He was rewriting it. He was creating, in the most audacious sense, a new reality, an alternate history for a holy figure. He waited for the precise moment, that sliver of time when the abbot's voice was a low murmur. The other monks absorbed in their own forms of internal struggle or slumber, and the weak morning light just barely illuminated his prayer book. With a deliberate slowness that belied the frantic pounding of his heart, Edwig withdrew a fresh, smooth scrap of vellum, no bigger than his palm, and placed it discreetly within the folds of his large prayer book. He selected a freshly sharpened lead stylus from its hiding place, its dull tip poised above the blank surface. His hand, usually so steady when copying, trembled slightly. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, picturing the scene, hearing Agnes's voice as clear as if the woolly philosopher were standing beside him. Then, with a deep breath that went unnoticed amidst the communal murmuring, he pressed the lead to the vellum. The first scratch was almost imperceptible, a faint whisper against the smooth surface. He focused, not on the forbidden nature of the act, but on the words themselves, on forming the letters with monastic precision, as if he were copying a sacred text, not inventing one. He began not with a grand statement, but with a piece of dialogue, a direct response from Agnes to the arrogant centurion, Brutus, who had just threatened Oldhelm with dire consequences. "Hark, fellow of cumbersome sandals and ill-advised pronouncements," Edwig carefully etched, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Dost thou truly believe that the strength of thy iron and the bluster of thy voice can deter the unwavering spirit of one whose flock understands the true rhythm of the cosmos, better than thy entire legion combined. Forsooth, thy understanding of pastoral defense is as lacking as thy grasp of basic logic. He paused, his stylus hovering. His words, were there, tangible, etched into the vellum. They were not scriptural. They were not devotional. They were, in fact, rather impertinent, especially coming from a sheep. A quiet, almost inaudible chuckle escaped him, immediately stifled. A thrill, sharp and exhilarating, shot through him. He had done it. He had crossed the line. The very act of forming those letters, of seeing his internal narrative externalized, was more potent, more liberating than a mere sketch. The lead, usually a tool for silent illustration, had become a conduit for pure, unadulterated narrative. He continued, barely daring to breathe, adding Brutus's bewildered response and Aldhelm's calm, saintly rebuke. The words flowed, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, filling the small scrap of parchment. He described the faint glimmer of divine light around Aldhelm's shepherd's crook, the rustle of Agnes's wool as the sheep shifted its weight, the way Bertram the badger bared a single surprisingly clean tooth in a display of quiet menace. The language was a curious blend of formal monastic phrasing and the whimsical, irreverent tone he cultivated for his characters. It was, he realized, utterly and undeniably ease. The hours of prayer stretched on. The Latin drone a familiar backdrop, but Eadwig was no longer merely enduring them. He was transforming them. Each moment of stillness, each lull in the communal recitation, became an opportunity. His private world, once confined to images, had now found its voice. The guilt, that initial prickle of sacrilege, faded into the background, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer just a bored monk scribbling to stay awake. He was a chronicler, a storyteller, a clandestine author of an entirely new kind of hagiography. The line had been crossed, the first unauthorized words committed to parchment, and in that quiet, unassuming act, the first known fanfiction had truly begun its strange, improbable journey within the hallowed silent walls of the Abbey of St. Alcuin. The deep regret promised in the title, was still a distant echo, drowned out by the quiet satisfaction of a story finding its full articulate voice. Chapter 5. Ink-Stained Regret. The initial exhilaration that had surged through Brother Eadwig upon penning those first audacious lines of St. Aldhelm's embellished life persisted for a glorious, terrifying span of days. Each stolen moment, each discreet scratch of lead against vellum, was a fresh draught of forbidden joy. The characters, once merely figments of his imagination, had taken on a vibrant, almost tangible reality within the quiet confines of the Abbey of St. Alcuin. Agnes, the discerning sheep, would deliver a biting retort precisely when Eadwig needed a laugh. Bertram, the perpetually grumpy badger, would gnaw on an imaginary Roman sandal, offering a silent, comforting presence. Lady Aurelia, with her noble bearing and secretly yearning heart, brought a tender human warmth to the otherwise sterile monastic routine. Eadwig felt less like a monk and more like a puppeteer, a clandestine chronicler, breathing life into a universe entirely his own. The boredom, that gray suffocating blanket, had been lifted, replaced by the thrilling hum of clandestine creativity. This clandestine hum, however, was about to evolve into a shrill, piercing shriek of dread. The shift began subtly, a faint prickle at the back of Eadwig's neck during matins, an hour traditionally dedicated to contemplating the brevity of life and the inevitability of divine judgment. As the abbot's voice droned through a particularly severe passage from a treatise on monastic obedience, Eadwig found his gaze drifting from his carefully concealed parchment to the intricate stern faces of the painted saints on the chapel walls. These were the true saints, the ones whose lives were recorded in meticulous, unvarnished truth. Their suffering depicted with a brutal honesty that left no room for talking animals or chaste, romantic entanglements with pagan noblewomen. A cold, clammy hand seemed to grip Edwig's heart. His breath caught in his throat. What had he done? He wasn't merely scribbling. He was eager writing. He wasn't simply imagining. He was fabricating. And not just any fabrication, but one involving a venerated, albeit obscure, Saint Datewide. The line he had so gleefully crossed, the boundary between innocent daydream and audacious creation, suddenly loomed as a gaping chasm, at the bottom of which lay not merely disciplinary action, but something far, far worse. Heresy. The word reverberated in his mind like the clang of a funeral bell. Heresy. He knew the stories. Every monk did. Whispers of brothers sent to distant, harsher abbeys, or, God forbid, worse fates. Tales of public penance, of floggings, of excommunication, and for those whose transgressions touched the holy texts, the possibility of the pyre. While the Abbey of St. Alcuin was a relatively placid establishment, monastic justice, when it awoke, was swift, unyielding, and utterly devoid of humor. There would be no appreciation for the whimsical nature of Agnes' philosophical pronouncements, no admiration for the tender, forbidden love between Aldhelm and Aurelia. They would see only the grave offense, the defacement of sacred truth, the audacious invention where only reverence should exist. His hands, which only moments before had been itching to continue Aldhelm's latest escapade, a daring rescue of a lost Roman legionnaire who had predictably stumbled into one of Bertram the Badger's particularly noxious traps, now felt cold and clammy. He surreptitiously slid the parchment scrap back into his habit, his fingers fumbling with unexpected clumsiness. The smooth vellum, once a symbol of liberation, now felt like a damning piece of evidence, each etched word a betrayal. He imagined Father Anselm, the keeper of books, with his keen, unwavering gaze, discovering his secret cache. He pictured Abbot Thomas, his stern face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and righteous fury, holding aloft a page on which Agnes the sheep was explaining the finer points of Roman agricultural policy to a bewildered centurion Brutus. The absurdity of his creations, once a source of private delight, now amplified the horror of the potential consequences. How could he explain a talking badger named Bertram? How could he justify a saint falling in love, even chastely, with a pagan noblewoman, when the very essence of sainthood often revolved around eschewing all earthly attachments? He couldn't. He would be seen as deranged, blasphemous, or both. A sheen of cold sweat broke out on his brow, despite the chill of the chapel. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The rhythmic chanting of the Psalms, which had previously served as a hypnotic backdrop to his creative endeavors, now felt like a relentless accusatory drone, each Latin syllable condemning his secret transgression. Dominus tecum peus aeric, et cum spiritu tuo, the Lord be with you, and with your spirit. But was the Lord with a spirit that invented talking sheep and romantic martyrs? He doubted it profoundly. His days, once meticulously divided between monastic duties and his secret passion, now became a frantic internal struggle. The joy of creation had curdled into a bitter, gnawing anxiety. Every shadow seemed to conceal a watching eye, every hushed whisper a potential denunciation. He became paranoid, scrutinizing the faces of his brethren, searching for any hint of suspicion. Was Brother Gregory's Gasse? A little too long. Did Father Anselm's quiet cough imply he knew something? He jumped at every unexpected sound, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The very tools of his illicit trade, the lead stylus, the precious scraps of vellum, became objects of terror. He found himself constantly checking the hiding places for his writings, beneath a loose floorboard in his cell, tucked inside the hollowed-out spine of an old neglected commentary on obscure prophecies, even, once briefly, under the altar cloth, a notion he quickly dismissed as truly inviting divine retribution. The ink, or rather the lead stains, on his fingers, once a badge of honor, now felt like a brand of guilt. He scrubbed at them fiercely after each clandestine writing session, using coarse sand and cold water, hoping to erase not just the physical marks but the indelible stain on his soul. Sleep, which had been his enemy during the long hours of prayer, now became his tormentor at night. His mind, once so eager to conjure the adventures of Aldhelm, now replayed endless scenarios of discovery and punishment. He saw himself being dragged before the ecclesiastical court, a solemn assembly of grim-faced bishops and abbots, his ludicrous tales recited aloud, prompting not amusement but horror and condemnation. He envisioned the scorn, the public humiliation, the utter destruction of his quiet, if boring, life. The abbey, once a haven of tedium, now felt like a gilded cage, and he, Brother Edwig, was a bird with wings of wax, having flown too close to the forbidden sun of artistic license. The irony was not lost on him, though it offered little comfort. His grand rebellion against boredom had led him not to freedom, but to a new, far more profound form of imprisonment. The constant crushing fear of exposure. The quiet satisfaction of a story finding its full, articulate voice had been utterly drowned out by the thunderous roar of impending doom. He regretted it deeply with a cold, hollow ache in his gut. Every line he had written, every talking animal he had created, every tender glance between Aldhelm and Aurelia was now a potential nail in his coffin, leading him, perhaps, not to a saintly reward, but to a very unfunny heresy trial. Chapter 6. The Abbot's Raised Eyebrow. The days following Brother Edwig's audacious foray into the realm of unauthorized hagiography had settled into a rhythm of heightened, almost unbearable anxiety. The initial, fleeting thrill of creation had long since been eclipsed by a cold, persistent dread. Each creak of a floorboard, each distant cough in the cloister, sent a fresh jolt of fear through him. His sleep, when it came, was fitful and plagued by nightmares of inquisitors with quills dipped in fire, or of Abbot Thomas, holding aloft a page on which Agnes the sheep was delivering a surprisingly well-reasoned argument for the strategic deployment of a flock of particularly stubborn ewes. The precious scraps of vellum, once his escape, now felt like a leaden weight in his hidden pouch, a ticking bomb awaiting discovery. He lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, a quiet internal panic that gnawed at his insides far more effectively than any prescribed fast. The dreaded moment, however, did not arrive with a dramatic flourish or a sudden righteous accusation. It arrived, as so many profoundly unsettling things do in monastic life, with an utterly mundane summons. It was a Tuesday during the hour of sext, when the sun, already past its zenith, cast long, indifferent shadows across the scriptorium floor. Edwig was meticulously, and therefore mind-numbingly, copying a particularly verbose commentary on the proper administration of monastic finances. A text so dry it could absorb all the moisture from the air. Brother Gregory, whose snores could sometimes be heard echoing from the refectory, shuffled over to Edwig's desk, his face impassive. "Brother Edwig," he rumbled, his voice like gravel, "the abbot requests your presence in his study. Immediately." Edwig's hand froze, a fresh blot of ink spreading inexorably across the vellum he had been working on. His stomach plummeted, as if the very foundations of the abbey had given way beneath him. This was it, the moment of reckoning. His heart began to hammer against his ribs with the frantic urgency of a bird trapped in a bell tower. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to flee, to somehow melt into the ancient stones of the scriptorium and become one with the dust motes dancing in the weak light. He managed a shaky nod, his tongue feeling like a wad of sandpaper in his mouth. The walk to the abbot's study felt like a penitential journey across an endless, barren landscape. Each step on the cold flagstones echoed the doom clanging in his head. He tried to mentally review his hiding places, desperately hoping that none of his more egregious fanfiction pieces had been discovered. He had been so careful, so secretive. But how? Had someone seen him? Had a scrap fallen out? Had Agnes somehow whispered his secrets to the monastery cat? Who then reported to the abbot? The last thought, absurd as it was, almost made him laugh, a dry, humorless sound that caught in his throat. Abbot Thomas's study was like the man himself, austere and functional. A single, sturdy oak table dominated the center of the room, laden with scrolls, ledgers, and a single unlit candle. The air was cool, smelling faintly of parchment and something indefinably old. The abbot himself sat behind the table, his back ramrod straight, his hands clasped before him. His face, usually a study in pious serenity, seemed to Eadwig to be carved from particularly unforgiving granite. As Eadwig approached, his knees threatening to buckle, his gaze fell upon an object resting on the oak table before the abbot. It was his small, personal prayer book, the one whose margins had served as the very first canvas for his burgeoning creativity. And beside it, neatly fanned out, was a collection of his illicit vellum scraps, each one bearing the faint telltale scratch of his lead stylus. His blood ran cold. The abbot's eyes, a pale, unsettling blue, fixed upon Eadwig. There was no anger, no immediate condemnation. Only a profound, almost weary stillness. It was far worse than an outburst. "Brother Eadwig," the abbot's voice was low, measured, devoid of inflection. "Pray, be seated." He gestured to the stool opposite him. Eadwig stumbled onto it, feeling utterly exposed, like a beetle pinned for inspection. "I found these," the abbot continued, his gaze unwavering, "during my customary inspection of the brethren's cells this morning." Good man. A necessary, if sometimes unedifying, duty. Your cell, brother, contained certain irregularities. He paused, allowing the silence to stretch, amplifying Eadwig's internal terror. Eadwig swallowed, his throat aching. "Forgive me, Holy Father. I know not what you speak of." A pathetic lie. He knew, but what else could he say? The abbot's gaze shifted to the prayer book, then to the vellum scraps. With a deliberate slowness that was agonizing to Eadwig, he picked up one of the scraps. It was the very first one, the one where Agnes, the sheep, offered his scathing retort to Centurion Brutus. The abbot held it up, his thumb idly stroking the edge of the vellum. His eyes scanned the faint, scratched words. "Harker, fellow of cumbersome sandals and ill-advised pronouncements," the abbot read aloud, his voice perfectly level. Yet the words, recited in his stern, formal tone, rendered the inherent absurdity of the line even more pronounced. He paused. It continues. "Dost thou truly believe that the strength of thy iron and the bluster of thy voice can deter the unwavering spirit of one whose flock understands the true rhythm of the cosmos better than thy entire legion combined? Forsooth, thy understanding of pastoral defense is as lacking as thy grasp of basic logic." The abbot lowered the vellum, placing it gently back on the table. His gaze returned to Eadwig, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes. "Brother Eadwig," he began, I confess my understanding of Roman military strategy, while not exhaustive, rarely included the deployment of sheep, much less those with an understanding of cosmic rhythms and a grasp of basic logics that surpasses an entire legion. And the term cumbersome sandals, while perhaps an accurate sartorial observation, seems unconventional for a serious theological or historical text. Edwig stammered, his mind racing for an explanation, any explanation that didn't involve the words heresy or imagination. Holy Father, it was a meditative exercise, a way to explore the depths of God's creation, even in its most unexpected forms. The sheep, you see, it was an allegory for the simple goodness that confounds worldly power. He knew he was babbling, digging a deeper hole with every word. The abbot picked up another scrap. This one depicted Bertram the badger, bearing a single, very clean tooth, while Professor Hoot, the owl, swooped down on a cowering Roman legionnaire. The associated text, faintly visible, detailed Bertram's uncanny ability to identify weak points in Roman armor, and Professor Hoot's unique talent for disorienting foes with ancient riddle. And this brother, the abbot held it up, this badger, Bertram, who seems to possess an unusual dental hygiene routine, and a penchant for Roman military critique, and the owl, Professor Hoot, who disorients with ancient riddles. Are these also allegories? Perhaps for the subtle wisdom found in nature's humblest creatures? There was a dry, almost imperceptible tremor in the abbot's voice, as if he were fighting a losing battle with an internal chuckle. Edric nodded vigorously, sweat beading on his forehead. Precisely, Holy Father, the Lord speaks through all his creatures, does he not? And the Romans, their arrogance would surely be confounded by the unexpected wisdom of the forest. The abbot slowly, deliberately, picked up the final piece of evidence. It was the most audacious of all, a detailed drawing of Lady Aurelia, her face etched with a complex mix of admiration and barely suppressed longing, gazing at Aldhelm, who stood serene amidst his sheep, his crook glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. The accompanying text described their unspoken bond, a love forged not in flesh, but in the pure crucible of shared spirit and quiet conviction. The abbot held this one closer, his pale eyes narrowing as he read the accompanying words. Her heart, once proud and tethered to the pagan gods, now beat a silent rhythm in harmony with the shepherd's gentle soul. A silent symphony played amidst the bleating of the flock and the distant rumble of Roman oppression. He lowered the scrap. Brother Edwig, he said, his voice now entirely flat, Saint Aldhelm is a known, if minor, martyr. His life, as recorded, speaks of humble piety and a brief, unexceptional encounter with a Roman scouting party. There is no mention of talking sheep, pugnacious badgers, riddling owls, or indeed any romantic entanglement, chaste or otherwise, with Roman noblewomen, however spiritually inclined. Are you suggesting, brother, that the Holy Spirit has chosen Yushi to reveal a previously unrecorded, rather elaborate, and singularly imaginative version of St. Aldhelm's life? Edwig squirmed on the stool, feeling the full weight of his transgression. The abbot's lack of immediate fury was more terrifying than any shouting. It was a calm, surgical dissection of his folly. Holy Father, I simply felt the original account was lacking in certain details. It seemed incomplete. My meditations led me to fill in the blanks, to imagine what could have happened, to give glory to God through the richness of his potential creation. Abbot Thomas leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled before him. His pale eyes drifted from Edwig to the scattered parchments, then to a distant, unseen point beyond the study walls. A silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thumping of Eadwig's heart. The abbot was contemplating a dangerous and unknowable process. Edwig braced himself for the pronouncement of his fate. Penance, transfer to a remote, wind-swept hermitage, perhaps even a more severe public humiliation. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the abbot's left eyebrow began to rise. It was not a dramatic arch, not a gesture of outright amusement, but a minute, hesitant elevation, a tiny rebellion against the stern discipline of his features. It conveyed a universe of unspoken thoughts, bewilderment, perhaps a flicker of incredulity, and an undeniable, if deeply suppressed, hint of the utterly bizarre. He looked at Eadwig, his eyebrows still slightly aloft, and then back at the depiction of Lady Aurelia gazing longingly at Aldhelm. "Brother Edwig," Abbot finally said, his voice still low, but with a new, almost weary undertone, "the Church in its wisdom has long held that divine creative license, when applied to the lives of its saints, typically manifests as miracles of healing, or perhaps the multiplication of loaves, not, generally speaking, as philosophical discussions with livestock." He paused, his gaze resting on the drawing of Agnes, or indeed, as tales of a badger's dental hygiene. "I confess, brother, your meditative exercises suggest a mind unusually fertile, and perhaps, brother, a mind in need of more rigorous, less imaginative, spiritual discipline." Dawned he. He gathered the vellum scraps, carefully stacking them. Eadwig watched, mesmerized, as his entire secret world was neatly bundled into a small, incriminating pile. "Your prayer book," the abbot said. "Your prayer book," the abbot said, pushing it back across the table to Eadwig, "you may keep. But these additions," he tapped the stack of parchments, "these will remain with me for now. I shall need to contemplate them further." His eyebrow remained subtly raised, a testament to the profound, quiet bafflement he clearly felt. "You are dismissed, brother Edwig. And for the immediate future, I suggest you focus your energies on transcribing, with utmost fidelity, the most uninspiring passages of the Book of Leviticus, and perhaps consider a stricter regimen of fasting. It may serve to rein in this divine creative license." Edwig rose, his legs trembling. The dismissal was not a condemnation, but it was far from a reprieve. He had not been excommunicated, not flogged, not sent to a remote hermitage, but his great secret had been laid bare, and the abbot, the very embodiment of monastic order, had seen the full, ludicrous scope of his fanfiction. The abbot's raised eyebrow, that subtle, almost imperceptible movement, spoke volumes. It was a silent judgment, a profound bewilderment, and perhaps, just perhaps, the smallest hint of a monk trying desperately not to laugh at a talking sheep. Edwig, however, felt no relief, only a fresh wave of mortification and a chilling uncertainty about his future. His regret, now ink-stained and exposed, was deeper than ever. Chapter 7. A surprisingly popular heresy, the aftermath of Brother Eadwig's unsettling audience with Abbot Thomas, settled over him like a shroud woven from mortification and profound anxiety. He had expected immediate, unequivocal condemnation, perhaps a public shaming, or at the very least, a transfer to a particularly damp and remote hermitage, where the only conversationalists would be moss-covered stones. Instead, he had received the abbot's raised eyebrow, a silent, eloquent testament to the utter bewilderment his creative transgressions had evoked. He had been dismissed, his prayer book returned, the damning scraps of parchment, his secret world retained by the abbot for further contemplation. The pronouncement to focus on the uninspiring passages of Leviticus, coupled with a stricter regimen of fasting, was a punishment, certainly, but one that seemed almost a trifle compared to the heresy trial he had so vividly imagined. Yet, a disquieting uncertainty lingered, a chill deeper than the abbey's perpetually damp stones. What would the abbot truly do with his fantastical tales of talking sheep and badger-led battles? The suspense was, in its own way, more tormenting than any immediate reprisal. Eadwig returned to his duties, a ghost in his own habit. Convinced that every passing monk was whispering about his folly, every creak of the refectory bench a judgment against his blasphemous imagination. His initial days were consumed by a hypervigilance born of terror. He scrubbed his hands raw, trying to erase the phantom lead stains. He avoided eye contact, walked with a purposeful stoop, and spoke only when absolutely necessary, often in a whisper that bordered on the inaudible. He felt utterly exposed, as if his very thoughts were emblazoned on the rough wool of his habit, for all to see. The silence of the cloister, once a balm, now felt like a vast, echoing chamber amplifying his shame. He was convinced that the abbot, unable to fathom the depths of his audacity, would eventually consult with higher authorities, and then the true, inescapable hammer of justice would fall. He awaited it with a dreadful resignation, a man bracing for the inevitable. But the inevitable, as it so often does in the Abbey of St. Alcuin, proved to be far stranger than anticipated. The first inkling came during the midday meal in the refectory. Usually a period of profound silence broken only by the clinking of spoons and the droning voice of the reader at the lectern. Brother Thomas, a portly man whose piety was matched only by his profound love of monastic cheese, was reading a passage from the Rule of St. Benedict. Eadwig, picking disconsolately at his boiled turnip, felt a slight tremor run through the table. He glanced up. Brother Bartholomew, usually a man of unflappable composure, had his hand clapped firmly over his mouth, his shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. His face was beet red, as if stifling a monumental sneeze. Eadwig frowned. What could possibly be so amusing in the Rule of St. Benedict? His own mind, still reeling from the abbot's interrogation, could find no humor in anything. Later that afternoon, in the scriptorium, a place usually conducive to monastic quietude, Eadwig noticed more irregularities. Brother Gerard, known for his meticulous, almost robotic copying, coughed into his hand, a rather drawn-out, theatrical cough that sounded suspiciously like a suppressed giggle. As Eadwig looked up, Gerard met his gaze briefly, a fleeting, almost imperceptible glint in his eye, a hint of something unmonastic and entirely unexpected. Eadwig attributed it to fatigue, or perhaps a strange form of silent mockery. Surely they were all laughing at him, the fool who wrote about talking sheep. The thought only deepened his shame. Then came the first direct, though still subtle, indication. During Compline, the final office of the day, when the monastery was steeped in profound darkness and the air was thick with whispered prayers, Eadwig heard it. A faint, almost subliminal sound, a barely audible scratching, followed by a muffled rustle. It sounded, unmistakably, like the delicate scrape of lead on vellum. And then, a moment later, a quiet, controlled snort from Brother Peter, who sat 3 stalls down. Eadwig's heart began to thud. Was someone else copying his work? But why? And who? The next morning, the evidence began to accumulate in disquieting ways. During chapter, the daily meeting where the abbot dispensed instructions and corrections, Father Anselm, the venerable keeper of books, adjusted his spectacles, and as he did so, Eadwig distinctly heard him mutter under his breath, "Agnes, indeed." Quite the philosopher. Anselm's face was utterly blank, his voice an indistinguishable mumble, but the word Agnes, the name Eadwig had given his wise sheep, struck him like a small, dull hammer. He nearly dropped his prayer book. Over the following days, the subtle signs became less subtle, escalating into a phenomenon that Eadwig could only describe as a widespread, covert, and utterly horrifying fandom for his unauthorized hagiography. He would overhear snippets of conversation, carefully phrased to seem innocuous, but unmistakably referencing his creations. "Did you hear about the centurion who couldn't find his way out of the north pasture last night?" Brother Michael would ask Brother Cuthbert, a faint smile playing on his lips. Perhaps he needed the wisdom of a particularly observant beast to guide him, eh? The north pasture was a specific setting in Edwig's latest installment, where Bertram the Badger had led a Roman patrol astray. Edwig would clench his fists under his habit, his face burning. He began to notice small, almost imperceptible movements during the interminable prayer hours. A small, carefully folded piece of parchment passed from one hand to another, often during the moments when Abbot Thomas's voice dipped to a low murmur. A suppressed snicker during a particularly solemn psalm. A series of hushed rapid whispers in the refectory corner, abruptly silenced when a senior monk approached. The air, usually heavy with piety, now seemed to hum with a secret subversive energy. His stories, his scandalous fabrications, were spreading like wildfire through the abbey, passed from monk to monk like forbidden candy. Edwig's horror deepened with each passing day. It wasn't just that his secret was out, but that it was out in the most embarrassing, unpredictable way. He wasn't being punished. He was being riddied. And worse, he was being enjoyed. The very brethren whom he had imagined condemning him were now, apparently, his secret readership. The monastic boredom, which had driven him to create, had also created a ravenous audience for his peculiar tales. He saw Brother Bartholomew, the one who nearly choked on his amusement during the refectory reading, approach him after Vespers. Edwig braced himself for pious rebuke. Instead, Bartholomew leaned in conspiratorially, his eyes twinkling. "Brother Edwig," he whispered. "That last part with Lady Aurelia trying to teach Bertram the Badger to play the lyre. Truly inspired. Although, I must say, Bertram's grumbling response about the lack of proper rhythm was quite in character." He winked, a shockingly unmonastic gesture, and then shuffled away, leaving Edwig utterly flummoxed. It was a nightmare woven from his own imagination. He had sought to alleviate his boredom, and in doing so, had inadvertently provided the entire abbey with a clandestine source of entertainment. And now he was caught in the middle. He was still terrified of the abbot discovering the e-circulation of his writings, a far greater offense than merely having written them. But he was also deeply, profoundly uncomfortable with the quiet, shared humor, the knowing glances, the almost conspiratorial camaraderie that now seemed to exist between him and his brethren, all centered around his absurd creations. He, Brother Edwig, the most unremarkable of monks, had become the unlikely purveyor of the abbey's most popular heresy. His quiet moments were no longer spent in fearful anticipation of punishment, but in mortified observation of his own unwanted fame. He heard Brother Silas debating with Brother Cuthbert about whether Agnes's wisdom stemmed from divine inspiration or merely an unusually acute sheepish perception. He saw Brother Gregory, the snorer, once caught sketching a tiny Roman centurion with exaggeratedly cumbersome sandals in the margin of a psalter. His precise choice of words for centurion, Brutus, was being quoted almost verbatim during chores. The secret romance between Aldhelm and Aurelia was a particular favorite, whispered about with a surprising amount of sentimental detail. The brethren, starved of any romantic narrative in their own lives, clinging to the chaste, longing gazes Edwig had so carefully described. The irony was crushing. He had meticulously hidden his work, fearing exposure. Now it was being passed from hand to hand, hidden under robes during office, read in the dim light of cells after compline. The abbey, once a silent bastion of rigid piety, now contained a secret network of literary enthusiasts, all devouring his imaginative tales. He, who had sought only to escape boredom, had inadvertently become the unwitting architect of a new, illicit, monastic subculture, and the thought of it made his stomach churn with a fresh wave of regret. He had not only transgressed, he had provided the means for collective transgression, all born from a yearning for a good story. The potential consequences now loomed larger than ever, not just for his own soul, but for the quiet, ordered sanctity of the entire abbey of St. Alcuin. The terror was no longer just his, it was a shared, collective secret, and that made it infinitely worse. He was trapped in a web of his own making, spun from boredom, ink, and the surprisingly receptive minds of his fellow monks. Chapter 8. The saint strikes back the abbey of St. Alcuin, once a bastion of predictable quietude, had subtly, almost imperceptibly, transformed into a peculiar hive of clandestine literary activity. Brother Edwig, the unwitting author of this monastic sensation, found himself trapped in a new, more elaborate form of purgatory. The initial fear of the abbot's censure had been replaced by a gnawing mortification at the unexpected popularity of his fanfiction. Every hushed whisper, every suppressed chuckle in the refectory, every furtive glance exchanged over a psalter, felt like a fresh layer of hot coals on his already burning cheeks. His brethren, the very men with whom he shared a vow of silence and austerity, were now his secret avid readership, and their collective amusement was far more unbearable than any solitary punishment. The abbot, for his part, maintained an unnerving silence on the matter of the discovered vellum scraps, a silence that seemed to hum with unspoken judgment and a simmering yet unidentifiable decision. This unsettling state of affairs, coupled with his self-imposed penance of fasting from the meager cheese rations and the endless transcription of Leviticus, began to take its toll on Edwig's already frayed nerves. One particular night, after a day spent attempting to copy a chapter on the ritual cleansing of animal entrails, a task that utterly failed to distract his mind from the whispers of Agnes the philosopher had overheard, Edwig retired to his cell, feeling utterly depleted. The cold, damp stone walls seemed to press in on him, and the flickering rushlight cast dancing, accusatory shadows. He lay on his straw mattress, pulling his thin wool blanket up to his chin, but sleep remained an elusive, mocking phantom. His mind, instead of succumbing to the gentle lull of exhaustion, churned with a grotesque tapestry of images. Abbot Thomas with a single, perpetually raised eyebrow, Brother Bartholomew trying to stifle a laugh while chanting Vespers, and, most disturbingly, the spectral forms of his own creations, St. Aldhelm, Agnes, Bertram, and Lady Aurelia, parading through his thoughts with an insistent, almost demanding presence. A dull ache settled behind his eyes, a precursor, perhaps, to a headache or something far more unsettling. He drifted, not into true sleep, but into a feverish, uneasy stupor, where the boundaries between reality and the bizarre began to fray. The cell, or what he thought was his cell, slowly dissolved, replaced by a hazy, ethereal landscape. It was a pasture, he realized, but not the crisp green pastures of his imagination. This one was bathed in a sickly yellowish light, and the air hummed with an unnatural stillness. The sheep that dotted the landscape were not grazing peacefully. They stood motionless, their eyes fixed on him, their wool shimmering with an odd, unhealthy luminescence. The familiar scent of damp stone gave way to an cloying, sweet smell, like overripe apples left too long in the sun. Edwig felt a prickle of unease, a sensation far beyond the mundane anxieties of his waking life. This was a dream, he knew, but it possessed a terrifying clarity, a tactile reality that made his skin crawl. Then, from the shimmering, expectant flock, a figure emerged. It was not the serene, idealized shepherd saint he had so meticulously drawn and written about. This Aldhelm was shorter than Edwig had envisioned, and his humble tunic seemed perpetually askew. His face, though possessing the simple, honest features Edwig had given him, was etched not with beatific peace, but with a profound, almost comical, irritation. He carried a shepherd's crook, but instead of resting it gently, he tapped it rhythmically on the ground, a sound like a distant, disapproving clock. His eyes, the same pale blue Edwig had imagined, were narrowed, fixed directly on him. And from his lips, not the gentle pronouncements of a holy man, but a voice, surprisingly reedy and filled with an almost petty exasperation, began to speak. "Brother Edwig," the voice began, each syllable echoing strangely in the humid, still air of the dream pasture, "we need to have a word. A rather pointed word, if I may be so bold. Forgive my lack of formal address, but I find it rather difficult to be deferential when one's very existence has been, shall we say, creatively reinterpreted by a bored monk with an overactive imagination and a dubious grasp of historical accuracy." Edwig, rooted to the spot by a dream-induced paralysis, could only gape. "Saint Aldhelm?" he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "The very same," Aldhelm replied, tapping his crook again. "Or at least the original model before your embellishments. Now, about these embellishments. Let us begin, if you please, with Agnes." He gestured with his crook towards a large, particularly fluffy sheep standing slightly apart from the others. This Agnes did not wear spectacles, nor did it exude an aura of philosophical contemplation. It merely stood there, staring at Edwig with an unnervingly blank, yet somehow reproachful gaze. "Agnes," the saint continued, "is a perfectly respectable ewe. Excellent wool, good temperament, a solid, if unremarkable, bleat, but a philosopher, who dispenses cosmic wisdom and critiques Roman logistics. Brown, brother. With all due respect to your, shall we call it, divine creative license, sheep do not speak. Not even allegorically. Their primary concerns revolve around grass, water, and avoiding wolves. The notion that Agnes could engage in a Socratic dialogue with a centurion, let alone offer a scathing critique of Roman sandal design, is, frankly, preposterous. It makes me, as a humble shepherd, appear utterly mad." He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. Edwig tried to speak, to defend his artistic choices, his need for a foil, for a touch of whimsy. "But, holy saint, the stories of the fathers, they are full of talking beasts, donkeys that speak to prophets, serpents in the garden." Aldhelm sighed, a long drawn-out exhalation. "Ah, yes, the classics. But there's a difference, brother. Those were divine interventions, momentous occasions. Not a daily occurrence for a shepherd boy to consult his flock on matters of imperial policy. My life was simple, quiet, entirely devoid of philosophical livestock." He looked at Agnes, who remained unnervingly still. She never even offered particularly insightful bleats, let alone a treatise on agrarian economics. Next, the saint's gaze drifted to what appeared to be a rather disheveled badger, lurking in the shadows of a thorny bush. "Bertram, donc, and Bertram," Aldhelm continued, his voice rising slightly in pitch. "A badger. Not a particularly social creature, I assure you. And while I grant you they are known for their tenacity, the notion that one would be named Bertram, or possess uncanny dental hygiene, or indeed lead a coordinated attack on a Roman patrol by gnawing through their greaves, brother, have you ever encountered a badger? They are not, to put it mildly, military strategists. They dig holes and eat worms. Their temperament is, at best, surly, not tactically astute. And as for the owl, Professor Hoot, who disorients with ancient riddles, owls hoot, Doctor. They hunt mice. They do not engage in rhetorical combat." Edwig felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over him. His glorious, imaginative battles now reduced to the absurd reality of actual animal behavior. He tried to protest again. But the narratives, holy saint, they needed action, conflict. A Roman centurion being confounded by a badger seemed more engaging than, well, just sheep. Aldhelm pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture uncannily human. Engaging? Brother, my life was a testament to quiet piety. The miracle was in the everyday. The simple goodness, the offering of bread to lost strangers. Not a coordinated assault by a menagerie of surprisingly articulate woodland creatures. You turned my humble existence into a pastoral farce. And the Roman soldiers, Marcus and his men, they were illusting. Lost, brother. Not persecutors. They were merely seeking directions. They were perfectly amiable, if a little bewildered by my rustic charm. You turned them into bumbling villains. And cumbersome sandals. Aldhen shuddered at. Perhaps a little unkind, even for a Roman. Then, the dream pasture shimmered again, and a third figure appeared. Lady Aurelia, Ponto Acundis. But this Aurelia was not the graceful, subtly yearning noblewoman Edwig had drawn. Her robes seemed to cling uncomfortably, and her aristocratic nose, which Edwig had so delicately rendered, seemed to twitch with a barely concealed irritation. She regarded Edwig with an expression of profound disapproval. "And you, brother," she said, her voice unexpectedly sharp, "decided to invent a chaste romance between myself and the good Aldhelm." She gestured vaguely at the saint, who shifted uncomfortably. "I was a Roman noblewoman. My life was dictated by societal expectation and political alliances. I was not, as your scribblings suggest, prone to wandering lost into remote British pastures, nor was I given to chaste spiritual yearning for humble shepherds, however pious. My concerns were entirely earthly, and frankly, rather dull. I recall a brief, polite exchange of directions, and then I went about my business. There was no silent symphony played, amidst the bleating of the flock, and the distant rumble of Roman oppression. There was no shared gaze across moonlit fields. There was no lyre-playing badger. Her voice rose with each denial, culminating in a huff of indignation. Aldhelm, regaining some of his composure, nodded vigorously. "Indeed. And the notion that I, a man dedicated to God, would entertain such a notion, even chastely. My thoughts were on my flock, and perhaps, occasionally, on the best way to mend a leaky roof, not on moonlit glances with Roman aristocrats." He looked at Edwig, his reedy voice suddenly firm. "My life, brother, was about quiet faith and humble service. It was about fading into obscurity, leaving behind only the faintest whisper of my piety. That was my truth. That was my martyrdom, if you must call it that. A quiet, unremarkable devotion that made me a saint precisely because I was so utterly unremarkable. You turned me into a character in a bard's fanciful song, a hero of epic, if ridiculous, proportions. The dream intensified. The sheep in the pasture began to bleat, not with their usual gentle cadence, but with a cacophony of demanding, accusatory noises that somehow sounded like fanfiction. Fanfiction. Inaccurate. Scandalous. Bertram the badger emerged fully, bearing not just one clean tooth, but an entire row of surprisingly pristine teeth, his grumble sounding like a deep, disapproving growl that echoed historical inaccuracies. Where is the historical accuracy? Professor Hoot swooped low, his eyes glowing with an incandescent, judgmental light, hooting a relentless refrain of puerile, poeile, unedifying narrative. Lady Aurelia stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot, radiating an aura of severe displeasure. Aldhelm stepped closer to Edwig, his face a mask of exasperation. "Brother Edwig, I appreciate the effort. Truly. And the drawings are, I suppose, not entirely without merit. The sheep's spectacles, I confess, did elicit a momentary flicker of something. But you turned my quiet life into a fantastical epic. I was canonized for piety, brother. Not for inspiring talking animals or improbable romances. My martyrdom, if it ever came, was likely quiet, unrecorded, perhaps involving a particularly aggressive ram or a poorly dug ditch. Not a grand, bloody confrontation with a legion of dim-witted Romans. You think sainthood is about entertainment? The dream pasture began to swirl, the sickly yellow light growing brighter, the bleating and hooting and grumbling rising to a deafening crescendo. Edwig felt himself shrinking, the full weight of his transgression pressing down on him. He had not only invented, he had misrepresented. He had not only blasphemed, he had debranded a saint with his own fabricated life. The very saint he was trying to honor was now furious, not at the heresy, but at the sheer, unbridled inaccuracy of his imaginative retelling. And the abbot's raised eyebrow. Aldhelm suddenly boomed, his reedy voice surprisingly powerful. Do you know how many perfectly good saints have suffered centuries of historical oblivion because some scribbler decided to improve their story? My original story was perfectly adequate for my purposes. Humble, dévoué, quietly pious. And now, thanks to your contemplative exercises, I am remembered as the saint with the philosophical sheep and the badger who audits Roman armor. This is not divine glory, brother. This is a humiliation. And frankly, it's going to make my official veneration rather awkward for generations to come. Why could you not simply have copied the text faithfully? Was it truly so difficult? The dream collapsed in on itself, a dizzying spiral of bleating sheep, indignant Romans, and Aldhelm's exasperated face. Edwig jolted awake in his cell, gasping for breath, drenched in a cold sweat. The silence of the night was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic snores of Brother Gregory. He lay there, trembling, the dream still vivid, the reedy, annoyed voice of St. Aldhelm echoing in his ears. The regret, which had been a dull ache, now sharpened into a searing pain. He had not only risked his own immortal soul and the wrath of the abbot, he had offended the very saint he had sought to elevate. The popularity among his brethren, once a source of mortified dread, now felt like a profound, shared sacrilege. His beloved fanfiction was, apparently, a historical inaccuracy that even the saint himself found infuriating. He buried his face in his rough wool blanket, vowing then and there to never again touch lead to vellum for any purpose other than the most literal, mind-numbing transcription. The boredom, he realized with a fresh wave of despair, was a far more palatable fate than the divine indignation of a historically inaccurate martyr. Chapter 9. Parchment Overload. The echoes of St. Aldhelm's reedy, exasperated voice still rang in Brother Edwig's ears, long after he had jolted awake from his fevered nightmare. The image of the saint, arms akimbo, berating him for the historical inaccuracies of a talking sheep named Agnes and a lyre-playing badger named Bertram, had seared itself into his consciousness. Coupled with the continued, insidious whispers and knowing glances from his fellow monks, their collective, unspoken delight in his forbidden narratives, Edwig felt as though his very soul were flayed and exposed. The abbot's unnerving silence, that single, perpetually raised eyebrow, hung over him like a sword of Damocles, threatening to fall at any moment. He was trapped in a web of his own making, a sticky tangle of imaginative heresy and unwelcome popularity. The dread was no longer a distant threat. It was a constant, suffocating companion. The regret, which had initially been a sharp prickle, had now blossomed into a full-blown, festering wound. He had transgressed not merely against the Church, but against the very sanctity of a forgotten martyr's truth. A desperate, singular thought began to germinate in the fertile, anxious soil of his mind. He had to undo it. He had to erase every last word, every ludicrous drawing, every shred of evidence of his fantastical endeavors. If only he could return to the profound, uncomplicated tedium of life before Saint Aldhelm and his eccentric companions had taken root in his imagination. If only he could scrub his mind clean of Agnes's philosophical pronouncements and Lady Aurelia's wistful glances. The physical manifestation of his sin, the scattered scraps of vellum now circulating covertly among his brethren, represented the tangible proof of his folly. They had to be destroyed. All of them. The problem, Eadwig realized with a fresh wave of panic, was not merely that the abbot possessed some of his initial lead-scratched fragments. The true horror was that, in his audacious pursuit of a more complete narrative, and to make his stories more legible for his secret, growing readership, he had begun to transcribe his best work onto larger, thinner pieces of vellum from the scriptorium using actual iron gall ink. This had been a grave escalation, a step beyond casual marginalia into the realm of formal, albeit illicit, manuscript creation. Ink, unlike the faint lead stylus marks, was a permanent, unforgiving medium. It seeped into the very fibers of the vellum, a dark stain that spoke of commitment, of deliberate intent. Removing it was not merely difficult, it was an act of violence against the parchment itself. That night, after the final prayers of Compline had faded into the echoing silence of the abbey, and the last rushlights had been extinguished, Eadwig rose from his straw mattress. The air in his cell was cold, tasting faintly of damp stone and a pervasive, lingering guilt. He fumbled in the darkness for his secreted tools, a small, sharp penknife usually used for sharpening quills or trimming parchment, and a piece of coarse pumice stone, kept for smoothing vellum surfaces. These were the instruments of his undoing, the means by which he hoped to excise the literary tumors he had so foolishly cultivated. His first target was a scrap of vellum he had managed to retrieve from Brother Silas earlier in the day, a page detailing a particularly vivid scene where Professor Hoot, the sage owl, outwitted a Roman centurion with a series of confounding riddles about the migratory patterns of lesser-known European starlings. This was one of his proudest narrative flourishes, and now it felt like a brand of shame. He held it up to the faint light filtering in from the tiny high window of his cell, the pale moonlight making the dark ink almost glow with accusation. With trembling hands, Eadwig uncapped the knife. He knew the procedure for correcting errors in manuscripts. Careful scraping with a sharp blade, followed by smoothing with pumice. But this was not a minor error. A misplaced letter or a misspelled word. This was an entire narrative, a sprawling, impertinent tale. He pressed the sharp edge of the blade to the vellum, just above the first line of Professor Hoot's perplexing riddles. He scraped, gently at first, then with increasing pressure as the ink stubbornly clung to the surface. A faint, almost sickly smell, a blend of iron gall and scorched animal hide, rose into the air. The initial scrape produced not a clean erasure, but a faint gray smudge. The ink, instead of lifting cleanly, seemed to spread, dissolving into the fibers of the vellum, creating a spectral outline of the words he wished to obliterate. Panic tightened its icy grip around his chest. He pressed harder, the knife digging into the parchment, the scratching sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence of the cell. The vellum, thin and delicate, began to fray at the edges. A small tear, jagged and irreparable, appeared near the top of the scrap. He swore under his breath, a shocking lapse in monastic discipline, immediately stifling the sound. He tried again, moving to another line, his movements growing more frantic. He scraped and scraped, the tiny, dark flecks of ink and vellum accumulating beneath his hands like dark, damning dust. But the words remained, albeit in a distorted, ghost-like form. Professor Hoot's first riddle now looked less like a profound intellectual challenge and more like a messy, indecipherable blotch. The delicate vellum, once smooth and pristine, was now rough and abraded, the surface irreparably damaged. It was less an erasure and more a violent defacement. Frustration, hot and desperate, surged through him. He seized the pumice stone, rubbing it vigorously over the damaged surface, hoping to smooth away the ghostly remnants of the ink. But the pumice, intended for subtle refinements, only roughened the already abraded vellum, making it fuzzy and translucent in spots. The words didn't disappear. They seemed to sink deeper, becoming an embedded stain, a permanent blemish that proclaimed his unauthorized creativity with even greater clarity. He was not erasing his mistakes. He was merely highlighting them, rendering them even more noticeable, more shameful. He moved on to another scrap. A page depicting Lady Aurelia offering a wildflower to Aldhelm, while Agnes and Bertram watched with varying degrees of approval. The poignant innocence of the scene, once a source of quiet pride, now felt utterly scandalous. He scraped at Aurelia's delicate face, at Aldhelm's serene profile, at Agnes's wise, bespectacled, in the drawing gaze. The more he scraped, the more distorted the image became. Aurelia's face became a blur, Aldhelm's robes smeared, and Agnes's spectacles dissolved into an unfortunate ink blot that made the sheep look as if it had suffered some kind of traumatic eye injury. The process consumed him for what felt like hours, each clumsy attempt deepening his despair. He ruined piece after piece, the pile of mangled vellum scraps growing larger beside him. Some pages ripped entirely, leaving ragged holes where once there had been words and images. Others became so thin and abraded that light passed through them, revealing the horror of the underlying damage. The faint, ghostly imprints of words remained, like indelible shadows, testifying to the illicit narrative that had once filled these pages. His efforts to achieve invisibility had only resulted in greater visibility, a testament to his guilt that was now more pronounced, more physically manifest than the original offense. His fingers ached, stiff with the strain of scraping. His mind, however, was in far greater agony. He had set out to cleanse himself, to purge the abbey of his heretical scribblings. Instead, he had only made a mess, a physical, tangible mess that was far more difficult to conceal than a few neatly folded scraps. An abbot, upon discovering a pristine but illicit manuscript, might be bewildered. But an abbot discovering a pile of aggressively scraped, torn, and smeared vellum would surely recognize the clear signs of a guilty conscience, desperate to cover its tracks. The very act of attempted erasure was a confession in itself. A fresh wave of nausea washed over Edwig. His initial fear of a heresy trial, of public shame, seemed almost preferable to this slow, self-inflicted torment. He had made a mockery of a saint, annoyed him in a fever dream, and now he had made a mockery of himself, transforming his clandestine art into a grotesque display of ruined parchment. He had failed spectacularly at both creation and destruction. His regret was no longer ink-stained. It was vellum-torn, pumice-abraded, and utterly hopelessly visible. He buried his face in his hands. Surrounded by the physical detritus of his despair, the quiet hum of his imagination replaced by the frantic thumping of his own heart, echoing the final damning words of St. Aldhelm. Was it truly so difficult? Indeed it was. Infinitely so. Chapter 10. The Copyist Conspiracy. The scent of stale incense and cold stone seemed to cling to Brother Edwig like a second skin in the days following his disastrous, self-inflicted desecration of Parchment. His attempts to erase the fantastical narratives of St. Aldhelm had resulted not in pristine vellum, but in a series of smeared, torn, and utterly ruined scraps, each one a testament to his failed artistic endeavor and his now profound, unyielding regret. The nightmare of St. Aldhelm, arms akimbo, berating him for the historical inaccuracies of a talking sheep named Agnes, had cemented the conviction in Edwig's mind. He had not merely created, he had blasphemed, and in the most embarrassingly imaginative way possible. His private torment was amplified by the persistent, hushed whispers and knowing glances among his brethren. His fanfiction, the very thing he desperately wished to obliterate from existence, had, through some perverse miracle of monastic boredom, become the abbey of St. Alcuin's most sought-after, illicit entertainment. The abbot's continued silence on the matter of the confiscated parchments was perhaps the most unsettling torment of all, a lingering threat, a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. Edwick moved through his days like a ghost, meticulously copying the most uninspired passages of Leviticus as prescribed, his quill scratching a rhythm of penance on the vellum. His eyes, however, rarely focused on the sacred text. Instead, they darted nervously, scrutinizing every monk, every shadow, every fleeting expression. He half expected to see Brother Thomas, the abbot, emerge from the shadows, his perpetually raised eyebrow now etched with a deeper, more permanent bewilderment, bearing a stack of Edwig's mangled confessions. The shame, a bitter bile, sat heavy in his stomach, churning with every suppressed chuckle he overheard from a nearby stall. It was during one such afternoon, deep in the scriptorium, that the seeds of Edwig's complete, utter despair began to sprout into a full-blown, terrifying harvest. The scriptorium, usually a sanctuary of controlled quiet, was particularly vibrant with the diligent scratching of quills. Brother Edwig, his own hand aching from transcribing the precise dimensions of the tabernacle, watched as Brother Alcuin, a junior monk barely past his novitiate, hummed a tuneless chant while meticulously copying from a stack of vellum sheets. Alcuin was young, earnest, and possessed an unshakable, almost disquieting enthusiasm for the meticulous labor of transcription. He approached every text with a wide-eyed reverence, convinced that every word, every phrase, however mundane, held some profound, hidden, spiritual truth. Edwig had often observed Alcuin. The junior monk was known for his neat hand, his unwavering focus, and his frustratingly cheerful disposition, even when faced with the most arid theological tracts. He was the kind of monk who found profound joy in correcting a misplaced comma or perfecting the flourish of an initial letter. Today, however, there was an unusual spring in Alcuin's careful movements, an almost buoyant energy that seemed utterly out of place in the normally somber scriptorium. He would pause, a faint smile playing on his lips, then dip his quill and continue his copying with renewed vigor. Edwig's blood ran cold. He recognized that particular smile. It was the smile of a monk secretly enjoying something. He had seen it on Brother Bartholomew, Brother Silas even, once on the perpetually dour face of Brother Gregory. It was the smile of someone devouring the forbidden candy of his own imaginative heresy. But why Alcuin? The young novice was, by all accounts, the very embodiment of monastic rectitude. He tried to dismiss it, to focus on the overwhelming number of cubits required for the sacred courtyard. But his gaze kept drifting back to Alcuin. The junior monk's quill moved swiftly, yet carefully, forming words that Edwig, from his vantage point, could not quite discern. But then Alcuin shifted, and a particular phrase, penned in the familiar elegant script of Brother Silas, caught Edwig's eye. It was a description of the Roman centurion Brutus, lamenting his cumbersome sandals, a detail Edwig himself had invented in a fit of whimsical exasperation. A cold sweat broke out on Edwig's brow. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, convinced he must be hallucinating from lack of sleep and too much Leviticus. He looked again. No, it was unmistakable. The phrase was there, clear as day, and Alcuin was copying it, his brow furrowed in earnest concentration, as if it were the most sacred of scriptural truths. Edwig felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated horror course through him. How? How had Alcuin obtained one of his stories? And why was he copying it so diligently? The answer, when it dawned on him, was far more terrifying than any direct condemnation. Alcuin was not enjoying a forbidden secret. He was transcribing it into an official document. He had, with the innocent diligence of a lamb, absorbed one of the circulating unofficial copies of Aldhelm's expanded life, and was now, in his sincere monastic piety, immortalizing it in the hallowed pages of a new bound manuscript. Edwig's mind raced, recalling the quiet moments he had witnessed, the passing of parchment, scraps from hand to hand during compline, hushed whispers in the refectory, the knowing glances. His brethren, having acquired the initial lead-scratched tales, must have meticulously copied them onto cleaner, ink-laden vellum, perhaps even adding their own subtle embellishments. It was a covert, communal effort, a silent conspiracy of copyists, and Alcuin, the earnest novice, was the unwitting final link in the chain, legitimizing the heresy by integrating it into the Abbey's official collection of hagiographies. He watched, paralyzed by dread, as Alcuin turned a page, and there, plain as day, was a meticulously copied drawing, a faithful reproduction of Edwig's own creation, Agnes the sheep, complete with spectacles, engaged in what appeared to be a philosophical debate with a rather bewildered Roman legionnaire. The associated text, flowing in Alcuin's neat hand, included the line, "And Agnes, whose intellect surpassed that of many a Roman senator, posited that true military strength lay not in the sharp edge of the gladius, but in the unwavering conviction of one's pastoral duties." Edwig felt a faint hysterical laugh bubble up in his throat, immediately stifled by the overwhelming urge to vomit. This was worse than any punishment he could have imagined. His attempts to destroy the evidence had failed utterly, and now, not only were his stories circulating, but they were being enshrined as truth by an innocent, diligent hand. The irony was so profound it felt like a physical blow. He had feared the abbot discovering his personal scribbles. Now the abbot might discover an entirely new, fully bound volume, painstakingly copied by a junior monk, containing the very fabrications Edwig had so desperately tried to undo. And this new volume would be far more convincing, far more difficult to dismiss as mere marginalia. He remembered his frantic scraping, the torn vellum, the smeared ink, all of it utterly pointless. The tales had escaped him, taken on a life of their own, copied by appreciative brethren, and now, unbelievably, finding their way into the official annals of the Abbey. His regret, already bottomless, found new, unimaginable depths. He had not only blasphemed, he had infected the very wellspring of monastic knowledge. He, brother Edwig, was the unwitting progenitor of a popular, officially sanctioned heresy. A quiet conversation reached his ears, carried on the cool, still air of the scriptorium. It was Alcuin speaking to Brother Cuthbert, another junior monk, his voice hushed with reverence. "Brother Cuthbert, have you yet seen these remarkable new additions to the life of St. Aldhelm? Such vivid detail. One could almost believe the sheep truly spoke, and the insights into Roman senatorial debates are surprisingly profound. Father Anselm said they were newly discovered fragments, and I am blessed to be the one to transcribe them for the greater glory of God and the edification of the brethren." Edwig's head swam. Newly discovered fragments. Father Anselm, the keeper of books, had, presumably, found Edwig's own confiscated parchments, and perhaps in a moment of absent-mindedness or profound weariness, had mistaken them for genuine, albeit unusually colorful, historical finds. Or worse, he had recognized them and, with that perpetually raised eyebrow, had subtly sanctioned their dissemination, perhaps as a test of faith, or simply out of a dry, unspoken amusement. The thought sent a fresh wave of nausea through Edwig. His abbot, a man of profound piety, was either unwittingly complicit or, more terrifyingly, secretly entertained. He watched Alcuin, diligently dipping his quill, adding another line to the burgeoning, officially sanctioned narrative of St. Aldhelm's life. He was writing about Bertram the Badger's surprisingly insightful critique of the Roman aqueduct system, a passage Edwig had invented during a particularly dull session of prayer. Edwig felt a tremor of despair ripple through him. The story was out there. It was beyond his control. His desperate attempts to undo his work had not only failed, but had somehow inadvertently paved the way for his ridiculous fictions to become part of the monastic record. The grand, sweeping epic he had once dreamed of, born from boredom and a desperate need for intellectual stimulation, was no longer a private solace or a clandestine act of rebellion. It was a monastic phenomenon, a burgeoning collection of canonical, if highly improbable, hagiography. The abbey, designed to be a bastion of truth and order, was slowly, quietly, being permeated by the whimsical, satirical product of one monk's overactive imagination. And Brother Edwig, the original author, could do nothing but watch, consumed by the agonizing irony of his newfound, utterly unwanted, and dangerously popular legacy. The true regret was not just for what he had done, but for what he had unleashed upon the unsuspecting, boredom-starved world of monastic scholarship. Chapter 11. A Pilgrimage of Shame. The weeks that followed Brother Edwig's disastrous attempt at parchment erasure, and the chilling realization that his fabricated tales of St. Aldhelm were being copied and enthusiastically circulated among the brethren, even, God forbid, entering the official abbey records via the earnest quill of Brother Alcuin, were a slow agonizing descent into a new circle of personal hell. The abbots continued unnerving silence on the matter of the confiscated original manuscripts, punctuated only by that single perpetually raised eyebrow, was a torment worse than any outright condemnation. It was the silence of judgment deferred, of a storm gathering on a distant horizon. Edwig, however, was already caught in a downpour of mortification. Every suppressed cough, every whispered aside, every furtive smile he witnessed among his fellow monks was a fresh lash, reminding him that his greatest shame was now the abbey's most popular secret. His dreams, when they came, were still haunted by the reedy, exasperated voice of St. Aldhelm, complaining bitterly about historical inaccuracies, and the sight of Agnes the sheep, staring at him with a look that somehow conveyed both profound wisdom and utter disappointment. The unbearable weight of his transgression, combined with the equally unbearable weight of its unexpected popularity, pushed Edwig to a desperate, singular conclusion. He must seek absolution directly from the source. He must make a pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Aldhelm. The idea was born during a particularly soul-crushing hour of prime, while he was meticulously, and therefore agonizingly, transcribing a lengthy decree regarding the proper method for mending monastic sandals. His mind, however, was not on leather and awls, but on the pervasive, almost tangible, presence of his own fictions within the abbey walls. He had started this whole absurd endeavor out of boredom, had then plunged into fear, and now found himself steeped in a potent cocktail of shame and unwanted notoriety. There was only one path to true penance, he reasoned, one way to truly atone for the literary crimes he had committed against the holy, if historically sparse, memory of St. Aldhelm. He would travel to the obscure shrine, offer a personal, heartfelt confession, and perhaps, just perhaps, the saint himself, or at least the divine will that guided him, would intervene and somehow erase the damnable narratives that were now spreading like a particularly virulent monastic fever. It was a desperate, illogical plan, born of profound spiritual anguish and a deep-seated need to undo what had been done. But it was the only plan he had. Obtaining permission for the pilgrimage was, surprisingly, not as difficult as he had feared. He approached Abbot Thomas with a demeanor of exaggerated piety, speaking in solemn tones of a profound spiritual calling to venerate the less frequented shrines, particularly that of the humble St. Aldhelm, whose life he emphasized was so often overlooked. He did not mention the talking sheep. The abbot merely regarded him with that now familiar, subtly raised eyebrow, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes, before granting permission with a curt nod, and a mumbled injunction to reflect deeply on the true nature of humility. It was almost as if the abbot knew, and was sending Eadwig on a journey not just for penance, but for a confrontation with the full, absurd reality of his own making. Eadwig, too consumed by his internal torment, chose to interpret it as a begrudging acceptance of his piety. The journey itself was an exercise in extended discomfort and mind-numbing repetition, a mundane mirror to the monastic life he temporarily escaped. He traveled mostly on foot, occasionally securing passage on a creaking cart laden with wool or cheese. The roads were muddy, then dusty, then muddy again, depending on the vagaries of the late autumn weather. The landscape unspooled before him in a monotonous blur of rolling hills, intermittent forests, and scattered, often inhospitable, villages. His feet ached, his habit grew stiff with travel dust, and the occasional splash of mud, and his mind, despite the change of scenery, remained stubbornly fixated on his literary transgressions. He ate meager meals of hard bread and water, slept in damp, draughty hospices, and found himself constantly reciting the more punishing psalms as a form of self-flagellation, hoping to physically purge the imaginative sin from his weary bones. This, he thought, was the true path of repentance, physical hardship and mental torment, all brought about by a talking sheep. The irony was not lost on him, though it provided no comfort. He rehearsed his confession countless times in his head, refining the words, seeking the perfect blend of contrition and explanation, though he still had no idea how to explain Agnes. After what felt like an eternity, but was in fact merely a week and a half of arduous travel, he arrived in the remote hamlet, rumored to house the shrine of St. Aldhelm. It was a small, unassuming cluster of wattle and daub cottages huddled around an even smaller, ancient stone chapel. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. The village seemed utterly unremarkable, devoid of any grand spiritual significance, which, in a perverse way, reassured Eadwig. This was the perfect place for a quiet, obscure saint, and thus the perfect place for a quiet, humble confession. He imagined a lone, wizened custodian, perhaps a solitary devout peasant who would listen to his tale with a patient, if bewildered, ear and offer a simple blessing. He approached the chapel, his heart thrumming with a mixture of apprehension and a strange, desperate hope for absolution. The wooden door, unadorned and weather-beaten, creaked open with a groan that echoed in the quiet air. He stepped inside, expecting to find the cool, damp silence of an unvisited sanctuary. Instead, a low hum of voices greeted him. The chapel, though small, was not empty. A handful of figures, perhaps a dozen or so, stood or knelt before a simple, rough-hewn wooden altar upon which rested a crudely carved statue of a shepherd boy holding a crook. A small, unexpected gathering. Eadwig's carefully constructed mental image of a solitary confession shattered. He felt a fresh wave of anxiety, but, steeling himself, he moved towards the back of the chapel, seeking a quiet corner to observe before making his approach. As he drew closer, the hum of voices resolved into distinct words. And then Eadwig froze. His blood ran cold, a chill far deeper than the chapel's damp air. A sturdy, red-faced woman in a simple woolen cloak knelt before the altar, her eyes closed in fervent prayer, her voice resonating with deep conviction. "O Saint Aldhelm, protector of the innocent, how your humble Agnes, the sheep of profound wisdom, did counsel you against the cunning of the Roman legionaries, revealing their plans for the taxation of peasant flocks, and how you, with the insight gifted by that woolly philosopher, did confound them with truths they could not comprehend." Eadwig's jaw dropped. Agnus, taxation of peasant flocks. This was not the original, fragmented account of St. Aldhelm. This was Yixing's story. His ludicrous, invented philosophical sheep. He felt a prickle of sweat break out on his brow, despite the cold. He looked around wildly. Could this be a coincidence? A shared delusion? No. It was not. A few paces away, a grizzled old man with a gnarled walking stick was murmuring to a wide-eyed child. And then, my boy, Bertram the Badger, with his single shining tooth, did gnaw through the centurion's very graves. Aye, a cunning beast, that Bertram. And Professor Hoot, the owl, did descend from the heavens. Bertram, Professor Hoot, the Badger's dental hygiene. His mind, usually so adept at conjuring elaborate fictions, now struggled to process the horrifying reality unfolding before him. His creations, born of boredom and penned in secret, were not only known, but being enthusiastically retold, as if they were enshrined truths, by devout pilgrims, seeking solace and inspiration from the very saint he had so audaciously, so shamelessly misrepresented. He pressed himself against the cold stone, trying to melt into the shadows, his breath catching in his throat. This was a nightmare far more vivid, far more humiliating than any fever dream. He had come here to confess, to unburden his soul of the weight of his artistic sins. But how could he confess when the very people he sought to confess to were already celebrating his fictions as divine fact? A young couple, their faces alight with a tender reverence, knelt close to the altar. The woman, her voice soft and melodious, began to speak, her words clearly audible in the quiet chapel. And noble Lady Aurelia, whose heart, once bound by pagan ways, was drawn to Aldhelm's pure spirit like a moth to a divine flame. Their love, a chaste unspoken bond, transcended all earthly divisions, blooming silently amidst the bleating of the flock and the distant rumble of Roman oppression. It was a love that taught us all that true devotion knows no boundaries of wealth or station. Edwig felt a wave of nausea. The chaste romance, his most daring, most secretly cherished invention, now a pious tale for pilgrims. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He remembered the abbot's raised eyebrow. Had the abbot known? Had he, in his unfathomable wisdom, allowed this monstrous, humorous truth to propagate, perhaps as a unique, dryly ironic punishment for Edwig's hubris? He wanted to scream. He wanted to confess right then and there, to interrupt the pilgrims, to shout, "These are lies. I made them up. The sheep does not speak. The badger does not gnaw through greaves." There was no Lady Aurelia, but the words stuck in his throat, choked by the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of the situation. How could he, a mere monk, contradict the fervent belief of these pilgrims, whose faith was clearly strengthened by his invented narratives? He who had sought to desecrate a saint's true, humble life had inadvertently, horrifyingly, created a more popular, more engaging version of it. He was not a heretic. He was a popular entertainer. He remained there, slumped against the pillar, listening to the unfolding horror of his own legacy. He heard variations of his tales, embellished further by the pilgrims themselves. New details added, new miracles attributed, new feats of badger heroism recounted. His original, fragmented source material was now completely buried under layers of his own, and now others, imaginative additions. Saint Aldhelm, the humble shepherd, had become a fantastical, animal-whispering, Roman-confounding hero of epic proportions, all thanks to Edwig's boredom. The regret, deep and ink-stained and parchment-torn, settled over him with a crushing finality. He had come seeking absolution, hoping to undo his work. Instead, he had found that his literary crimes had become articles of faith. There was no going back. The story had escaped, taken on a life of its own, far beyond the confines of the abbey, far beyond his control. His unique, embarrassing heresy had become a surprisingly popular, widely accepted truth. He closed his eyes, the image of St. Aldhelm's exasperated face from his dream burning behind his eyelids. The saint was not just historically inaccurate, he was commercially successful. And Eadwig, the bored monk, was the accidental architect of this bizarre, unholy triumph. The pilgrimage of shame had led him not to repentance, but to the crushing realization that his regret would now be eternal, echoed in the enthusiastic retellings of countless pilgrims, all believing in the sacred truth of a talking sheep named Agnes. Chapter 12. The Birth of Apocrypha. The return journey to the Abbey of St. Alcuin was, for Brother Eadwig, a pilgrimage not of repentance, but of an even deeper, more profound shame. Each step on the muddy road, each creak of a passing cart, resonated with the horrifying realization that his literary crimes, far from remaining a localized monastic secret, had somehow leaped the abbey walls and infected the wider world of medieval piety. He had arrived at St. Aldhelm's obscure shrine, ready to abase himself, to confess his imaginative transgressions to the very source of his sin, only to find devout pilgrims enthusiastically recounting his invented tales of a philosophical sheep named Agnes, a tactically astute badger named Bertram, and a chaste, longing romance with Lady Aurelia d'Orteau. The very essence of his manufactured regret had been turned on its head. He was not a heretic. He was, inexplicably, a popular storyteller. The irony was a bitter, persistent taste in his mouth, far more unpleasant than any prescribed fast. He walked with the solemn, bowed head of a man burdened by an invisible yet crushing weight. The familiar landscape of rolling hills and distant forests, once a monotonous blur, now seemed to mock him with its quiet indifference. He passed hamlets where occasionally he would hear a snatch of conversation from a peasant at a well, or a merchant haggling over livestock, and his heart would seize. Was that a mention of a surprisingly wise animal? Was that a reference to a Roman centurion confounded by an unexpected turn of events involving a particularly stubborn ovine? His paranoia, far from abating, had mutated into a finely tuned instrument for detecting his own literary legacy in the most unexpected corners of the world. He kept his hood low, avoiding eye contact, hoping to remain an anonymous, penitent monk, rather than the unwitting purveyor of popular, if apocryphal, hagiography. Upon his return to the abbey, the atmosphere within its stone walls seemed to have shifted. The quiet whispers and knowing glances among the brethren had, if anything, intensified. They no longer seemed to merely enjoy his stories. They seemed to almost revere them. Brother Silas would approach him with a deferential cough, then discreetly inquire, "Brother Eadwig, on your pilgrimage, did you perhaps encounter a particularly resilient variety of thistle? One might ponder its allegorical significance in the context of enduring relentless persecution, much like one imagines. A certain badger of our acquaintance might endure a particularly ill-aimed spear." It was a question so thinly veiled in monastic piety that it felt like a direct endorsement of Bertram's fictional heroism. Eadwig would merely nod mutely, his face a mask of weary resignation, and retreat to the relative safety of the scriptorium, where he could, with utmost fidelity, copy more passages about the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, hoping the mundane precision would somehow cleanse his soul. The abbot, for his part, maintained his characteristic composure. He merely nodded at Eadwig's return, offered a brief, almost perfunctory blessing, and once again that single, subtly raised eyebrow was Eadwig's only clue to his superior's thoughts. The confiscated parchments were never mentioned. The enhanced regimen of Leviticus transcription remained. But Eadwig sensed a shift, a deeper, more complex understanding behind the abbot's pale eyes. It was as if Abbot Thomas, in his profound, quiet wisdom, or perhaps his equally profound, quiet weariness with monastic trivialities, had come to terms with the peculiar phenomenon brewing within his abbey. Edwig, in his moments of solitary reflection during the long dark hours before vigils, began to contemplate the sheer, overwhelming absurdity of his situation. He had merely sought to escape the profound tedium of his existence, to fill the vast, empty spaces of his mind with something, anything more stimulating than endless chance and repetitive transcription. And, in doing so, he had inadvertently stumbled upon a truth that was, in its own way, as profound as any theological doctrine. The human mind, he realized, craved narrative. It yearned for stories that possessed color, character, and a touch of the extraordinary. Even in the most sacred contexts, the official lives of the saints, though undeniably holy and edifying, were often stark, minimalist accounts, focusing on pious suffering and miraculous interventions without delving into the mundane, humorous, or even romantic aspects of a human, or indeed, animal, life. They presented saints as marble statues of virtue, admirable but perhaps not entirely relatable. Edwig's tales, however preposterous, had injected life, personality, and an unexpected wit into the otherwise dry bones of a forgotten martyr. He thought of the pilgrims at St. Aldhelm's shrine, their earnest faces alight with devotion, their voices ringing with the very stories he had fabricated. They found inspiration not just in Aldhelm's piety, but in Agnes' wisdom, in Bertram's loyalty, in Aurelius' chaste devotion. These characters, these narrative threads, however apocryphal, resonated with something deep within them. They made the saint more accessible, more human, more real, even if that reality involved a talking sheep. He began to see his own accidental creation as a tiny, almost invisible thread in the vast, sprawling tapestry of religious storytelling. For centuries, people had embellished, expanded, and reimagined sacred narratives. How many of the wildly improbable tales of saints and holy figures, now accepted as venerable tradition, had perhaps begun not with divine revelation, but with the quiet, creative rebellion of a bored scribe in a scriptorium, or a tired preacher seeking to make a sermon more engaging, or a weary pilgrim desiring a more colorful tale to share on the road? The Bible itself, he mused, contained stories that varied, accounts that seemed to contradict, details that hinted at multiple tellings and retellings across generations. Perhaps the Lord, in his infinite wisdom, knew that the human spirit, while seeking truth, also sought narrative. The notion of Apocrypha, of unofficial texts and embellishments, was a familiar one to Edwig. He knew of the Gospels that were deemed uncanonical, the additional tales of Christ, and the apostles that never made it into the official church canon. He had always been taught to shun them, to view them as dangerous deviations from divine truth. Yet now, through the bizarre lens of his own experience, he began to see them differently. Perhaps they were not malicious heresies, but merely the natural overflow of human imagination, the irrepressible urge to fill in the blanks, to add color, to make a compelling story out of the sparse facts. They were, in a peculiar sense, the original fanfiction, born from a collective desire for more, for different, for a narrative that spoke to the human heart in its myriad, often absurd, complexities. His own regret, which had been so sharp and consuming, began to soften, not disappear, but morph into a kind of weary, ironic acceptance. He had intended to erase his sin, but he had merely contributed to a long, unofficial tradition. His shame, immense as it was, now carried a strange, almost humorous, historical weight. He was not merely Brother Edwig, the bored monk. He was Brother Edwig, the unwitting progenitor of a new popular cult of St. Aldhelm, complete with a philosophical sheep. His actions, born of utter tedium, had not only saved him from sleep, but had, in their own small, ridiculous way, woven themselves into the fabric of popular religious belief. He still transcribed Leviticus, and he still fasted from the meager cheese, but a fundamental shift had occurred within him. The boredom of monastic life no longer felt like a suffocating blanket. It felt like a vast, empty canvas. And though he had vowed to never again touch lead to vellum for imaginative purposes, a tiny spark of a new idea occasionally flickered in the darkest corners of his mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, the story of a bored monk who wrote the first fanfiction and deeply regretted it might itself be a tale worth telling. A strange footnote in the grand, meandering history of human narratives, both official and wonderfully, ridiculously apocryphal. And perhaps even a saint, after centuries of quiet veneration, might secretly enjoy being given a talking sheep. The thought, fleeting as it was, brought a faint, almost imperceptible smile to Brother Eadwig's lips, quickly suppressed. A quiet rebellion against the relentless solemnity of it all. Chapter 13. From heretic to reluctant folk hero, the Abbey of St. Alcuin, that bastion of quiet piety and, more accurately, profound boredom, slowly faded from the bustling stage of history. Centuries rolled over its stone walls like the ever-present mists that once clung to its cloisters. The ceaseless chants diminished, then ceased altogether, replaced by the whisper of the wind through crumbling arches. Over time, the abbey became a ruin, its purpose forgotten by the peasantry who quarried its stones for new cottages, its very name a faint echo in the annals of local lore. The monks themselves, Brother Eadwig among them, passed into the quiet oblivion reserved for souls whose lives were lived in the shadow of grander narratives. Their meticulously copied texts, their solemn prayers, their subtle internal rebellions against the relentless tedium, all seemed destined for the dustbin of history. The original fragment of St. Aldhelm's life, the one that had sparked Eadwig's unfortunate imagination, along with the growing official monastic copy containing Agnes the sheep and Bertram the badger, were either buried beneath collapsed masonry or, more fortunately, transferred to the sprawling, dusty archives of larger, more resilient cathedrals and universities, only to be promptly forgotten amidst countless folios of conventional theology and mundane ledgers. And so, the centuries marched on. The world outside transformed beyond the wildest imaginings of Brother Eadwig. Kingdoms rose and fell. New technologies harnessed lightning and air, and the very concept of information was no longer bound to vellum and quill. Yet, in the quiet, undisturbed corners of the world, time often preserved strange things. It was during a particularly hot summer in the late 19th century that a team of earnest, bespectacled antiquarians, led by Professor Armitage of the Royal Historical Society and his protégé, a rather excitable young Dr. Eleanor Finch, descended upon the overgrown ruins of St. Alcuin. Their mission, to meticulously catalogue and preserve any remaining monastic artifacts, hoping to shed light on the obscure liturgical practices of the early medieval period. They unearthed crumbling foundations, rusted monastic implements, and, crucially, a small, remarkably well-preserved collection of vellum manuscripts that had been tucked away in a collapsed crypt, shielded from the worst depredations of time and elements. Among these finds were several volumes of Lives of the Saints, typical hagiographies, albeit somewhat water-damaged and worm-eaten. And then there was a Wolf-Teich volume, a stout, leather-bound folio, clearly a later copy, its script elegant and precise, the very hand of Brother Alcuin, though his name was unknown to them, titled simply, The Miracles and Meditations of the Blessed Aldhelm, Shepherd and Saint. Professor Armitage, a man whose life revolved around factual accuracy and rigorous historical methodology, initially dismissed it as a minor, perhaps apocryphal, regional hagiography, not uncommon for the period. But Dr. Finch, possessing a keen eye for the unusual and a healthy skepticism for the entirely conventional, found herself increasingly captivated by its contents. She began to read aloud from it one evening, during a lull in their dig, the flickering lantern light casting dancing shadows on the tattered pages. Her voice, initially formal, soon took on a note of bewildered amusement. And then verily did the Roman centurion Brutus A man of cumbersome sandals and ill-advised pronouncements, find himself confounded not by the shepherd's strength, but by the profound wisdom emanating from the mouth of Agnes. A particularly well-informed sheep, Professor Armitage choked on his lukewarm tea. A sheep, Dr. Finch? Are you quite well? This must be a scribal error, a metaphor lost in translation, or a later, unscholarly interpolation. But Dr. Finch continued, her voice gaining a peculiar blend of academic detachment and genuine delight. Agnes, whose intellect surpassed that of many a Roman senator, posited that true military strength lay not in the sharp edge of the gladius, but in the unwavering conviction of one's pastoral duties, particularly in the effective management of strategic grazing patterns during winter encampments. She paused, her eyes wide. And here, Professor, is a vivid illustration. A sheep wearing spectacles lecturing a Roman soldier. And look, on the next page, a badger named Bertram gnawing through a legionnaire's greave. Bertram, whose singular tooth shone with a purity of purpose, did audit the very weaknesses of Roman ironwork, a critique born not of malice, but of biological insight and an abiding dislike for imperial taxation on root vegetables. The small academic community gathered around their flickering lanterns in the ruins of St. Alcuin, erupted into a cacophony of bewildered chuckles and fervent academic debate. Here, unearthed from centuries of monastic dust, was a text unlike any other they had encountered. It contained the expected pious reverence, the standard miraculous interventions, but intertwined with it were elements of astonishing, whimsical, and utterly uncanonical absurdity. The great debate began, stretching from the late 19th century into the early 20th, and evolving with the advent of new scholarly approaches. Was this Life of St. Aldhelm a genuine apocryphal text, reflecting a hitherto unknown, highly allegorical tradition within early monasticism? Or was it, as some argued, a clever satire, a subversive work of humor aimed at the dry, repetitive nature of hagiography itself? Dr. Alistair Croft, a prominent literary historian in the early 20th century, championed the rogue genius theory. This monk, Edwig, for we have traced the earliest stylistic precursors of this text back to a brother Edwig of St. Alcuin, though the final, widely circulated copy is by a later hand, was clearly a brilliant, if deeply irreverent satirist. He understood the inherent limitations of conventional hagiography and sought to infuse it with life, wit, and a subtle critique of authority. The talking animals, the absurd military tactics, the chaste romance, these are not errors, but deliberate acts of creative genius. He was a proto-novelist, working within the strictures of his time, using humor to comment on both the mundane and the divine. He revolutionized the concept of saintly narrative, a visionary, trapped by his historical context, but now, finally, revealed. Croft lectured passionately, his voice echoing in grand university halls, holding aloft grainy photographs of Edwig's original sketches, particularly the one of Agnes in spectacles. But then came Professor Hilda Albright, a formidable medievalist and a staunch proponent of the profound boredom theory. Rubbish, Dr. Croft. While the literary merit of these embellishments is undeniable, attributing them to deliberate genius is a romantic overreach. Brother Edwig was, quite simply, profoundly, soul-crushingly bored. His imagination, starved of stimulation by endless chance and mind-numbing transcription, patched onto the scant details of a forgotten saint's life, and simply exploded. The talking sheep and philosophical badgers were not allegories for complex theological concepts. They were the desperate, subconscious ramblings of a man trying desperately to stay awake during matins. He was not a rogue genius. He was a very ordinary monk, exceptionally bad at enduring tedium, and his creativity was merely a coping mechanism against spiritual slumber. The regret mentioned in the Abbey's later, highly discreet, internal correspondence, which we have also unearthed, suggests a monk terrified of discovery, not a conscious satirist seeking to make a statement. He was merely, I contend, illustrating the profound power of boredom as a catalyst for narrative, however absurd. The debate raged. Theologians weighed in, some condemning the Aldhelm appendix as a charming but dangerous heresy, others attempting to find deeper, almost Gnostic spiritual meanings in Agnes's cosmic wisdom. Art historians marveled at the unexpected vibrancy of the marginalia, tracing Edwig's evolution from simple doodles to complex narrative scenes. Historians of social customs even debated whether the chaste romances of Aldhelm and Aurelia reflected a genuine, suppressed yearning for human connection within monastic communities, or was simply the escapist fantasy of one deprived scribe. In the end, no definitive conclusion was reached. Brother Edwig, the obscure bored monk, found himself posthumously thrust into the curious limelight of academic scrutiny. His deepest fear, that his literary crimes would be discovered and condemned, had ironically led to his unexpected, if deeply ironic, fame. He was not a heretic in the conventional sense, for his work had been absorbed and disseminated, becoming a beloved, if officially unacknowledged, part of a saint's lore. He became instead a reluctant folk hero for the scholarly community, a testament to the unpredictable nature of creativity, the enduring power of narrative, and the strange, often humorous, ways in which the human spirit finds avenues for expression, even in the most restrictive of environments. His regret, that deep, ink-stained, parchment-torn regret he felt in life, became the very cornerstone of his curious legacy. It was the human element, the fear of punishment for simply daring to imagine, that made his story so compelling to future generations. For they debated not just the text, but the man behind it. Was he a pioneer, or a pitiable victim of monastic routine? Was his work a conscious artistic statement, or merely the desperate effort of a bored mind to fill the endless, quiet hours? Perhaps, as the more introspective scholars mused during late-night conferences, it was both. A strange, enduring monument to the fact that sometimes the most profound and peculiar creations arise not from divine inspiration, but from the simple, unyielding, and utterly pervasive monotony of a medieval monastic snooze. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of St. Aldhelm, whose life had been so gloriously, ridiculously rewritten, still sighed in exasperated amusement at the sheer unbridled inaccuracy of it all.